The ridge of limestone broke the Montana sky like a crooked spine, and the woman who had spent 3 years learning to read that sky knew what the color of it meant before she ever looked at the thermometer nailed to the porch post. 17 degrees. The kind of cold that split rain barrels along their seams, that made the breath of a horse look like the ghost of everything the horse had ever hoped for. Wren Calloway had been awake since 4 o'clock. This was the architecture of every morning she had spent under the low pine roof of the Danner homestead. 3 winters, 3 springs, 3 summers, that ended before she was ready for them to end. She fed the chickens in the dark, split kindling with the hatchet she had sharpened herself 2 nights before, sitting on the back step with a whetstone and a lamp, working the angle by feel because her right eye had gone weak in that particular lamplight the previous winter from too many hours of close needlework. The stove she coaxed from its bed of gray ash with the patience of a woman who had learned that a fire, like most things worth having, could not be rushed, only tended. She put the coffee on. She carried the 2 tin cups toward the bedroom because in 3 years of living in this house she had developed the specific instinct of a woman who understands that a man who oils his going-to-town boots before the sun rises is a man about to tell you something you will not want to hear standing up. Those boots were by the front door, not the muddy work boots he wore to move cattle through the river pasture, the buffed ones dark as wet walnut, polished with the rag she had washed on Sunday last and left to dry on the fence rail. She had looked at them for a full count of 10 before she looked at the door. The boots told her everything the morning had not yet said aloud. He was not in the bedroom. He was on the porch. He was not alone. The woman standing beside Cole Danner was the image of a different country entirely. A fur-trimmed collar the color of heavy cream, gloves of soft kid leather, the kind that had never known a Montana November, a traveling hat pinned at such a precise angle that the wind moving through the cottonwood stand across the yard could not shift it by a fraction. She held a carpet bag against her hip with the casual authority of a woman who expected every room she entered to already know her name. She was perhaps 24. Her skin had the particular quality of a person who had never gone to bed hungry in a house where the pipes had frozen. Behind them both, his hat already in his hand, stood Sheriff Emmett Pryor. He held the hat the way a man holds a hat at a graveside service nobody wanted to schedule. His horse was hitched to the fence rail beside a matched pair of dark bay horses in fresh harness, and behind those horses sat a wagon loaded with goods that Wren's eye swept over in a single practiced pass. A new Chicago pattern parlor stove with nickel fretwork on the door, 2 crates of coal oil, bundled wool blankets from the Denver mills, a crate of canned peaches stenciled in black block letters, a dressed side of beef in muslin. A live goose in a slat cage regarded the entire proceeding with the flat moral authority of a bird that has been recently inconvenienced. Wren did not drop the cups. She would think about this later in the dark of a different place, cataloging the small dignities she had managed to hold on to that day. She set both cups on the porch rail with the deliberate care of a woman placing something breakable on a high shelf. She looked at Pryor first, because Pryor's face would tell her the shape of the trouble before Cole's mouth did. Emmett Pryor had known her father during the Union Pacific survey work near Havre in the years before Marcus Calloway's lungs gave out. He had watched Wren carry her mother's medicine bag into 3 separate cabins during the diphtheria run of 1883. He had once in this very yard refused payment for delivering a letter from the county seat because he said it was the least a decent man could do for the daughter of Marcus Calloway. His face this morning was the face of a man being asked to perform the least decent act he had ever been paid to perform. His hands did not leave the brim of the hat he was already holding. His breath came out in a long, slow plume that the cold broke apart against the porch post before it could reach her. Cole spoke first. She would carry this fact for the rest of her life. Not the woman, not the sheriff, but Cole, who had held her through the long February night after their son came into the world too early and did not draw a single breath. Cole, who had said into her hair that he would carry her grief for both of them until the mountains wore flat. Cole, who now stood on the porch of the house she had made livable in 3 winters of unrewarded work and used the word arrangement. Their arrangement, he called it, as though the years had been a lease agreement on a piece of farm equipment. He explained in the measured, rehearsed voice of a man reading from a document he had memorized that a woman named Vivian Ashby of Helena had done him the honor of accepting his proposal of marriage. that the wedding would take place at Christmas in her father's parlor, that she would need a house not presently occupied by a woman whose name did not appear on any document of legal significance. He said he was sorry. He said that Sheriff Pryor had accompanied him to ensure the transition was orderly. He said that she had 30 minutes to collect her personal effects. Personal effects meant clothing she had owned before her arrival at the ranch, correspondence bearing her name, nothing else. He did not look at her when he said any of it. He looked at a point slightly above her left ear at the pine board. He had asked her to help him nail into place the previous August while she held the board steady, and he drove the nails. Vivian Ashby smiled at her. It was not a cruel smile. It was something worse, the smile of a woman greeting a housekeeper she had inherited, along with the curtains warm in the way that expected no reply. Wren's chest did something she had not felt since her mother's last hour. A slow contraction with no sound to it. She wanted to say the name of their son, the name they had chosen together in the second month of her pregnancy, the name they had never spoken aloud to anyone, the name she had scratched with a knitting needle into the inside face of the cradle board before they buried it in the ash grove. She wanted to tell Pryor that she had stitched the shirt Cole was wearing under his coat, that the coffee in the tin cups had come from beans she had traded for by mending Hedda Greer's tablecloths 3 consecutive Sundays. She wanted to say a great many things. Instead, her voice found something she had not known she still owned. 30 minutes is generous for a woman who has nothing that belongs to her. She said it the way her mother had spoken at difficult bedsides, not coldly, not softly, but with the particular evenness of someone who has already done the accounting. She went inside. The trunk was the size of a bread box painted once worn back to bare pine by 3 seasons of open windows. Into it she placed her father's compass in its velvet-lined case, the velvet gone brown at the edges from years of handling. A pewter thimble her mother had pressed into service during the diphtheria week, not for sewing, but for measuring out whiskey to clean wounds, a fact that made it more precious than any ordinary thimble had a right to be. A packet of her mother's herbal receipts wrapped in oilcloth, some entries in ink, some in pencil where the ink had run out on a long night, and the work could not wait for morning. A photograph of her father as a young man in a tin frame the width of her palm, a bone-handled pocket knife, a tin of sulfur-tipped matches. Her father's Colt Peacemaker unloaded wrapped in oilcloth. 6 cartridges she counted into her palm one by one. The clothing she considered separately. 2 work dresses of gray linsey-woolsey, 1 Sunday dress in dark blue calico she had never worn on a Sunday because there had never been a Sunday that called for it, wool stockings, underclothes, a pair of her father's long johns cut down at the ankle, everything she was already wearing, flannel shirt, canvas trousers bought secondhand from a widow in town, leather belt work boots with the heels worn to the shank. Then the coat. The sheepskin coat hung on the peg beside the door. She had made it the previous winter from 3 fleeces she had bartered from a rancher named Hollis in exchange for stitching. The man's daughter's cheek closed after a horse kick had opened it to the bone. She had cured those hides herself in the woodshed, worked the wool with a comb she had fashioned from scrap wire, sewn the seams by lamplight across 4 consecutive nights at the cost of her right eye's clarity for a week afterward. Cole had watched her make it. Cole had, on the coldest evening of last January, wrapped himself in it while she sat bundled in a wool blanket beside the stove and called her clever. She reached for it. His hand closed over the collar before hers could. His voice, when it came, was almost apologetic. That quality made it considerably worse than anger would have been. The coat had been made with wool from his ranch. The ranch was his. The wool was therefore his. The coat was therefore his. He said this in the same even tone he had used to describe the wedding arrangements. Vivian would find a use for it, he added, and the way he said it made clear he meant she would give it to a hired hand rather than wear it herself. Wren released the collar. She would not fight for a piece of livestock byproduct in front of Emmett Pryor. She picked up the trunk, slung the burlap sack over her opposite shoulder, walked through the door past Vivian Ashby without turning her head, and carried everything she owned to the fence rail, where her mule, a gray-muzzled animal named Patch, stood with his ears pricked in the particular way he had of indicating that he already understood the morning was not proceeding normally. She had bought Patch 7 years earlier for $4 and a Sunday dinner from a freight hauler who had been prepared to shoot him for the philosophical crime of being old. Patch had not been young when she bought him. He had also not been stupid, which she had found over 7 years to be the more valuable quality. The oak door of the house closed behind her. She heard the drop bar fall into its brackets. She had cut that bar herself from a piece of green ash in the second week after her arrival, planed it smooth on the back step, while Cole watched from the kitchen window. The sound of it dropping now was the sound of a lock she had made being turned against her by a man who had watched her make it. Pryor walked with her to the mule. He said nothing until she had tied the trunk to the pack saddle with the double diamond hitch her father had taught her the summer she turned 9. Then he cleared his throat in the manner of a man clearing the way for a hard truth. He told her quietly that he had known this was coming for 3 weeks, that Cole had ridden to the county seat in September, paid a lawyer named Birch to draw up papers, that Pryor himself had signed nothing, and would sign nothing but the deed to the homestead had been in Cole's name, and his name alone since 1882, 3 months before Wren had first ridden up this wagon road on Patch's back, with a burlap sack, her father's compass, and her mother's book of receipts. He told her she should go to Hedda Greer, that Hedda would know what to do, that there were things a sheriff could not say standing in a doorway of a house he did not own, that he was sorry, that he would not sleep well. She looked at him the way she had looked at her mother in her last hour, with all the softness gone, only the tally remaining. She thanked him for his honesty. She said she did not judge him by the shape of a badge he had not asked to wear this particular morning. She meant it, though the meaning cost her something she could not afford to spend. She climbed onto Patch's back and rode east out of the yard, past the paddock she had re-roofed in her second summer, past the chicken coop she had built from scratch after the hawk winter took 17 birds in 6 days, past the ash grove where the small unmarked mound sat in the first fallen leaves of October, and she did not look back. Looking back would have given Cole Danner a picture he did not deserve to carry into old age. The road to Millhaven was 91 miles of open high country plain, interrupted by the limestone formations the old trappers had called the Warden Peaks, 3 miles west of town, where the cliff faces rose from the valley floor like the broken teeth of something enormous that had been buried standing up. She had counted her money twice while packing $4.30. She knew what that bought at a stage stop. It did not buy 91 miles. At the outside, it bought 1 night on a straw mattress and 1 feed of grain for Patch before the coins ran out. She rode anyway because sitting still on the road outside Cole Danner's gate was not a survival strategy in October at altitude, and because motion was the only thing standing between her and the thought of the ash grove. The sky did what sky in this country does in the 3rd week of October. It thickened. Clouds dropped off the Beartooth Range in a wide front the color of a bruise in its 7th day, and the wind that had been merely cold at dawn acquired the specific mean quality that announced snow within the hour. Wren had learned this particular taste of air through 3 Montana winters. It tasted like a coin held under the tongue, metallic, flat, patient. Patch knew it too. He walked with his ears laid back and his head lower than his preference, without complaining at her urging him to a faster pace, which was itself an alarming sign, because Patch complained about nearly everything. They reached the base of the Warden Peaks at what she judged to be an hour past noon, though the sun had given up the pretense of showing itself long before that. The road curved along the foot of the limestone wall. The wind coming off the cliff face had picked up an edge like a paring knife. She dismounted to walk him across a patch of loose shale, because that was the kind of ground that broke old mules, and she had not come this far with Patch to lose him to careless footing. She was leading him, picking the line by eye, when his left foreleg went sideways beneath him with a sound she felt in her molars before she heard it with her ears, a wet, organic crack that did not belong to any part of the day she wanted to be living. He did not scream. Patch had never been a screamer. He went down onto the shale on 1 knee, 1 leg folded at an angle no leg was designed to sustain, and he looked at her with the same patient reproach he had offered every time she had done something he found inadvisable. She knew the leg. She had seen its equivalent on her father's horse outside Havre in the winter of 1877. She knew what came next, and she knew that leaving him to the cold and whatever came down from the timber after dark was not a mercy she was capable of offering. She untied the trunk from the pack saddle. She unwrapped the oilcloth from the colt with hands that felt at this moment as though they belonged to someone else, a steadier woman, a woman with less ash grove in her recent history. She loaded 1 cartridge into the cylinder, knelt in the shale beside him, pressed her palm flat against the long bone of his cheek, put her forehead against the coarse gray hair between his eyes, and told him without speaking aloud that he had been a good mule. that $4 and a Sunday dinner had been the finest trade of her life, that she was sorry the road ended here for him and not somewhere softer. She stood, stepped back the length of her own arm, did what needed doing. The report bounced off the limestone wall 3 times before the wind took it away. Patch's body settled into the shale without drama. She stood with the Colt hanging at her side for a full minute, not moving. The tears that came were not for Cole Danner. They were not entirely for Patch. They were for the ash grove, for the fact that she had not been able to bring so much as a stone from it, for her father's belief that a man with a straight instrument and a true eye could measure his way clear of any trouble the world had to offer. She let herself cry for precisely as long as it took the wind to shift half a compass point. Then she wiped her face on the sleeve of her flannel shirt and began the slow work of considering what a woman with a trunk, a burlap sack, $4.30. No mule could reasonably expect to survive on an exposed road with the sky the color it was. The answer was that she could not. Chugwater was 23 miles east with no ranches between here and there she could count on for shelter. Half of them belonged to men who did regular business with Cole Danner and would think nothing of sending a rider ahead on her behalf out of pure professional habit. No coach was scheduled until Thursday. There was a westbound freight wagon expected at the crossroads. Wednesday morning was 40 hours away and 40 hours on an open road without shelter. In a rising storm at this altitude was not a calculation with a favorable outcome for a woman in a flannel shirt and a borrowed pair of canvas trousers. She looked up at the Warden Peaks. The recollection came with the sudden clarity available only to people whose circumstances have contracted to a single decision. Otto Fenwick, who ran the dry goods in Millhaven and had been in this country since before the town had a name, had told her a story the previous January while she waited out a snow squall in the back of his shop with a cup of chicory coffee warming both hands. He had known a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had come out from Ohio in 1873 to marry a silver claim man named Ambrose Trask. No relation to anyone in town who had disappeared in the fall of 1875 after a summer that everyone in Millhaven had decided by mutual silent agreement not to remember clearly. The official account was that Ruth had left with a traveling salesman. The account Otto had shared in the particular conspiratorial quiet of a man who wants company on a slow afternoon was different. Ruth Calloway had gone into the Warden Peaks with a bedroll and a sack of flour and had not come back down. Hunters over the years had reported smelling wood smoke rising from the cliff face on still winter nights when no living person had any business burning anything up there. She had listened the way one listens to a ghost story from an old man who wants an audience. She had not thought of it since. She thought of it now. She looked at the sky. She looked at the trunk. She looked at the shale road running east. She began to climb. She left Patch where he lay. She had no shovel, no time, and the snow would do for him before morning what she could not do with her hands. She carried the trunk on her back by running the burlap sack through its rope handles and cinching both across her shoulders like a peddler's pack. The Colt rode in her belt for the first time in her possession of it. The coil of half-inch rope she had cut from the pack saddle she looped over one arm. The tin of matches she tucked inside her flannel shirt against her ribs, where body heat would keep the sulfur from going damp. A game trail switchbacked 3 times across the lower slope before it gave out entirely. Above it she climbed by hand, finding holds in the limestone with the methodical patience of a woman solving a problem one grip at a time. By the time she had gained the first serious elevation above the road, she understood 2 things. Her hands were going to bleed before this was over, and her lungs were going to fail her before her legs did. The asthma had followed her since she was 6 years old. A permanent tenant she had learned to manage through specific pacing, specific posture, the small brown bottle of tincture in the trunk that her mother had formulated over years of trial and careful observation. There was a paper of dried mint leaves in her coat pocket that she could chew when the tightening started. She knew precisely the pace at which her breath would hold and the pace at which it would not. There was no pace on a limestone cliff in a building gale with a loaded pack that her lungs were willing to negotiate with her. She stopped 3 times in the first hour to press her forehead against cold rock and force her breath down into the floor of her chest, away from the tight upper register where the asthma lived. Each time she stopped, the wind was louder in the fissures above her. Each time the light had gone a shade further toward gray. She told herself not aloud, not as encouragement, but as plain arithmetic, that Ruth Calloway had climbed this cliff in 1875 wearing a long skirt and had survived long enough to become a story that a dry goods man still told on slow afternoons 10 years later. If a woman in a long skirt had managed it, a woman in canvas trousers could manage it too. The first flakes arrived at what she estimated was 3 in the afternoon, not the small dry flakes of a proper storm. These were the large, wet, indecisive flakes of a warning, each one the size of her thumbnail, each one landing on limestone and spreading into a slick coin-shaped patch that turned every handhold into a question she had to answer with her body before she trusted it with her weight. She climbed faster. She could not afford to climb faster. She climbed faster regardless. 400 vertical feet above the road, her boots found ice beneath fresh snow on a narrow ledge she hadn't seen clearly enough. Both feet went out from under her. The trunk shifted its weight across her back and pulled her sideways toward a drop she refused to measure with her eyes. Her hands found the tangled root mass of an uprooted cedar half torn from the cliff face. At some point in a summer she hadn't witnessed lodged now in a shelf of accumulated debris, and she held it. She hung against the root system with her whole weight for a moment that had no useful length, breathing the specific shallow breath of a woman who has just understood exactly how precarious everything is. She heard it then. Beneath the sound of the wind working through the crevices above her, beneath her own pulse loud in her ears, a sound like air being drawn slowly through a keyhole, coming from behind the root tangle pressed against her cheek. She pushed the roots aside with one hand while the other kept its grip. Behind them, half concealed by a curtain of pale mineral dust and dead bunch grass that had rooted itself in the limestone over years of patient accumulation, was a fissure in the rock. Perhaps 20 inches wide, perhaps 3 feet tall. The air flowing out of it was dry, not warm exactly, but warmer than the air on the ledge, warmer than any air had a rational right to be on an exposed cliff face in a rising storm. The difference was small but unmistakable, the way a candle in a distant window is small but unmistakable, and her body understood what it meant before her mind had finished forming the thought. She worked the trunk through first edgewise with the slow negotiating patience of a woman threading a needle in poor light. Heard it drop onto stone somewhere beyond, pushed the burlap sack through, then went through herself on her stomach, pulling her shoulders through the narrow throat of it, feeling limestone scrape a strip of skin from the point of her left hip, pulling her legs through, rising onto her knees in the dark interior of the mountain. She pulled the matches from inside her shirt. Her fingers had begun to lose their cooperative relationship with her brain. They worked but slowly, like a mechanism running in cold oil. She struck a match. It caught blue first, then yellow on the sulfur, and she cupped it in both palms and held it up. The chamber was the size of a country parlor. The floor was flat where it mattered, dished gently toward the center, as though worn by the passage of something patient over a very long time. The ceiling arched perhaps 12 feet overhead, dark limestone streaked with pale mineral seeps that the match lit up into thin threads of silver. Against the far wall, a stove of native stone mortared with rough clay. A chimney of stacked flat stones rose from it into a natural crevice in the ceiling, and when she squinted, she could see at the top of that crevice a faint disk of gray daylight, the outside sky visible from inside the mountain. Beside the stove, a rusted iron kettle. Beside the kettle, a stack of split wood gone gray with age, but sheltered from above by an outcropping of pale rock dry as bone. Beside the wood, a rough box of 3 planks joined with hand-forged square nails. The match burned down to her fingers. She dropped it before it could blister her, struck a second. She knelt at the stove and built the fire with the same methodical care she had brought to the stove in the Danner kitchen every morning for 3 years, except that this stove was older, stranger, and belonged to no one living. Dried bunch grass from the fissure entrance for tinder, 2 small pieces of the ancient split wood, a third match held to the grass, 1 careful breath from the deep bottom of her damaged lungs. The grass caught. The flame climbed. The wood dry through years of cave air took the fire with an eager, small violence. Within a minute she had flame the size of 2 fists, within 5 flame the size of a bread loaf. Within 20 minutes the stone stove had reached a steady low roar, and the heat radiating from its darkened face was the most beautiful thing she had ever put her hands toward. She held them out to it. She watched color return to her fingertips in the exact reverse order the cold had taken it away. Without deciding to, she began to cry. Not grief, not relief. Something that had no name she had ever been given. The crying of a woman who has been told in every language available that she cannot survive, who has just discovered alone in a room made by the mountain itself that the people who told her were wrong. She gave herself 4 minutes of it. Then she wiped her face with her shirt cuff and went to work because she had been raised by a bone setter and a surveyor, and neither of them had left her the luxury of remaining in pieces. She checked the flue first. The draft was strong and even. She could feel the pull of cold air being drawn upward through the stone chimney when she held her palm above the fire. No smoke gathered under the chamber's ceiling. Whoever had built this stove had understood what they were building. She checked the walls dry to the touch 6 feet up, no trace of mold or seep. The floor near the far wall held a shallow depression lined with clay, a catch basin for meltwater, the lining cracked with age but still visible. Someone had made this place livable with intent and effort and considerable time. She opened the box beside the woodpile. The lid lifted on leather hinges that had gone brittle with age. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth the color of tobacco, was a book. Small as her hand, bound in dark brown calfskin with a thong of leather tied around it to keep the covers closed. She untied the thong with the patience she had used on the fissure because the book had the quality of an object that would fall apart if rushed. The first page bore a name written in a firm, unhurried hand in brown ink faded to the color of weak tea. The name was Ruth Calloway. Beneath the name, a date, March 1874. Wren sat back on her heels in the firelight. Outside the fissure, invisible now beyond 10 feet of solid limestone, the storm she had been running from found its full voice, the sustained howl of weather that had made up its mind. The stove crackled against it. The chamber was growing slowly and steadily warm. And Wren Calloway read the diary of a woman who had been dead in the memory of an entire town for 10 years. The pages were a life. The life of a woman who had come to Montana to marry a man she had known through 6 weeks of letters and found in her first summer to be the kind of man who kept a whip on a nail by the kitchen door, not as a tool for animals, but as a message for everyone else in the house. The life of a woman who had learned to set snares for snowshoe hare in her second summer, who had traded eggs at the dry goods for a piece of oilcloth in her third, who had walked out of a house on the edge of Millhaven one night in August of 1875 with a bedroll over her back and a small hatchet at her belt, and a resolve she had written down on the first page of the diary in one line: "I would rather die on my own account than live one more hour on his." There were entries about the climb. Entries about the fissure which Ruth had found by chance pursuing a wounded jackrabbit that had gone into it and not come back. Entries about building the stone stove across 9 days that cost her the skin of both palms. Entries about the winter she survived on rabbit rendered fat and one desperate raid on a corn crib 6 miles east that she had undertaken on foot during a January thaw. Entries about the spring. Entries about a second smaller chamber at the back of the first which Ruth had used as a cold larder. At the very back, 3 entries in different ink written faster, less evenly. The first A came within a mile of the fissure last week. He does not know I am here yet, but he is looking. The second, I have decided I cannot risk another winter. I will go north when the weather breaks. I have heard there is work in the mining camps in the Northern Territory for a woman who can cook and keep her own counsel. The third and last. If any woman finds this book, know that the stove draws well and the second chamber keeps cold through July. The box beside the wood holds what I could not carry. Use it as your own. I leave what I built here the way I would leave a lantern in a window. My name was Ruth Calloway. I hope yours belongs to you. Wren closed the book. She sat with it in her lap in the light of the fire for a long time. She was not the first woman to have been put off a porch in Montana in October. She would not be the last. A stranger dead in the mind of a whole town for a decade had left her a lantern in a window. The debt she had just incurred had no name in any ledger she had ever been taught to keep, but it was the most binding debt of her life. She opened the box again. Under the oilcloth that had wrapped the diary lay a second bundle. She unwrapped it. A small hatchet with a hickory handle worn smooth to the color of old honey. A bone-handled awl, a rolled piece of soft leather holding a dozen fishhooks and a spool of gut line, a tin of black powder sealed with wax and stamped with a Denver merchant's mark from 1874, a small glass bottle that smelled uncorked of turpentine, a square of oiled canvas folded to the size of a handkerchief. At the bottom, a rough map on a piece of butcher paper showing the Warden Peaks from the south, with 3 small X marks along the cliff face and 2 more along the ridge above. Beside each X in Ruth's brown ink, a single word. The marks on the face read, "Shelter Water Cache." The 2 marks on the ridge above read, "Watch Out." She did not yet understand what watch and out meant separately placed, as they were at 2 different points on the ridgeline. She would find out. She set the map aside, rewrapped the tools, took the diary, and slid it inside her flannel shirt against her ribs, where the matches had been, because the matches were dry now, because the diary was the kind of thing that should be carried against a heartbeat. She fed 2 more lengths of wood into the stove, loosened her boots, spread the burlap sack on the floor near the fire, lay down on it, and began to take inventory of her body the way her mother had taught her to take inventory of a patient. Fingers pink again at the tips. Painful circulation restored no lasting damage. Toes numb, but present, the boots had done their work. Lungs tight and whistling faintly at the top of each exhale, the asthma had been woken by the climb. She uncorked the small brown tincture bottle from the trunk, let 3 drops fall on her tongue, felt the licorice and camphor pry open the top register of her chest by a small useful margin. Ribs bruised where the fissure had abraded her but intact, face raw with cold and salt. Mind clear, and this last surprised her. She had walked out of a house that had been her whole life at 7 in the morning, shot her mule at 1 in the afternoon, climbed a limestone cliff in a snowstorm at 4. By any reasonable calculation, she should be lying on a piece of burlap in a stone room with her mind in splinters. Instead, her mind was clear in the specific way. A winter sky is clear after a long storm, empty of weather, cold scoured. She lay on the burlap sack and looked at the shadows the firelight made on the ceiling of the chamber, and thought with a calm she did not entirely trust about arithmetic. A Wyoming winter at this altitude would run 100 days before the passes opened. A body her size performing the labor she was about to demand of it would need in the neighborhood of 2,500 calories a day to maintain both heat and function. 2,500 multiplied by 100 was 250,000. That number was the distance between her and spring. It was a number she could hold in her head. It was a number she could break into pieces, carry up this cliff piece by piece from the town that had already begun she suspected to find her absence convenient. She thought about the town. She thought about Hedda Greer at the Blue Elk Inn, who had once slid a plate of fried potatoes across the counter to a destitute drover without charging him, and had glared at Wren for noticing. She thought about Otto Fenwick, who had told her Ruth Calloway's ghost story on a slow afternoon, and would she judged keep his mouth shut about a woman buying unusual quantities of flour if that woman paid in coin and did not solicit his opinion? She thought about the tannery on the north end of Front Street and the hide scraps that went to the burn barrel at Week's End. She thought about the grain warehouse behind the depot and the jute sacks with torn seams that the railroad would not pay the freighters to return. She thought about 3 weeks. 3 weeks before the first hard freeze would seal the trail at the fissure and make supply runs impossible. 3 weeks was a piece of work. 3 weeks was survivable. She did not think about Cole Danner. She would think about him later the way you eventually think about a splinter, when there was adequate light and a needle available and time to do the thing properly. Before she slept, she said the sentence that had been sitting in her chest since the oak door dropped its bar. They put me out to freeze in the mud. All they managed to do was hand me a mountain. The stove answered with a low crackle. The storm outside the fissure agreed. Somewhere below in the town she had already begun planning her return to Cole Danner, was pouring whiskey for a woman in kid gloves and telling the story of a hired hand who had gone quietly. He did not know that 70 vertical feet above the road he traveled twice a week. A woman with his ranch in her memory. Her mother's receipts in her trunk had just done the arithmetic on what remained of both their lives and found his portion wanting. She slept. The fire held. The snow, when it began in earnest 2 hours after dark, fell without interruption until morning, covering the shale road below, covering the place where a gray mule lay with the patience of the already finished, erasing the marks of a woman who had not gone where anyone expected her to go. By the time Sheriff Emmett Pryor rode out at first light on the justification of checking the crossroads for stranded travelers, there was nothing on the road that told any story at all. He rode as far as the base of the Warden Peaks, stood in the falling snow for 10 minutes, with his horse's reins slack in one gloved hand, looking up at the cliff face with an expression that a man who knew him well would have recognized as the face of someone deciding deliberately, and with full awareness of the decision not to look for something he suspected was there to be found. He turned his horse east. He rode back to Millhaven at a pace that did not hurry. He told anyone who asked that the road east showed no sign of her, that a woman in her situation and weather of this kind was almost certainly already past Chugwater by now, or else had not made it that far. He said the second part very quietly. He did not look at the Warden Peaks when he said it. Above him in a room, the mountain had kept waiting for 10 years. Wren Calloway woke to a stove burned down to red coals, opened her father's compass in her palm to check that its needle still found north. Even after everything, drank a careful swallow from her canteen and began to plan the morning's descent into a town that had already started the slow, comfortable work of forgetting she had ever mattered. The descent at first light on the 15th of October was a lesson in how the mountain would test her every single day she chose it over the road. New snow had glazed the ledges to a surface like poured milk, so the fissure at the cedar root was harder to leave than it had been to enter, because leaving required her to trust a rope she had not yet fully tested to an anchor she had assessed only by feel in the dark. She tied the coil off around the cedar trunk with a bowline backed by a doubled overhand, the knot sequence her father had drilled into her on the trestle work outside Havre the summer she turned 13, lowered herself in controlled slides down to the shale road below. 12 slides, each one deliberate. The burlap sack was folded flat inside her flannel shirt against her stomach, where it would not catch the wind. The trunk stayed in the chamber. Everything of value had to stay in the chamber because she was walking into Millhaven as a woman with no fixed address, no assets anyone could see, and a trunk on a woman's back. In that condition invited the kind of questions she had no coin to answer. She skirted the place on the shoulder of the road where Patch lay buried under the overnight accumulation without stopping. There was a kind of accounting she owed him, but April was soon enough for that when the melt made such debts collectible. She put her back to the Warden Peaks, set her pace to the particular rhythm of a woman with an errand unhurried enough not to attract curiosity, purposeful enough not to invite charity, and walked east toward town in the specific early dark of a morning that had not yet decided to become day. The first person she encountered was a boy of perhaps 9 driving 3 milk cows across the wagon track toward the commons. He looked at her without interest. She was in his estimation a woman on the road before sunrise, of which there were several varieties in Millhaven, none of them warranting a second look. She kept walking, past the Methodist church that had not seen fresh paint since President Arthur's first year in office, past the assay office with its black lantern hanging cold by the door, past the pole corral behind the livery where a strawberry roan she had once helped deliver stood 3-legged in the far corner favoring her near hind. She reached Front Street at the precise moment Hedda Greer unlocked the Blue Elk Inn from the inside, shouldered open the door, bent to set an iron boot scraper on the porch boards. Hedda was 52 years old, built like a woman who had carried heavy things for a long time without complaint, her hair pinned in the tight, practical coil of someone who had been in the kitchen since 4 o'clock. Her apron bore a grease burn on the left hip from a skillet handle misjudged the previous week. She straightened, saw Wren on the plank sidewalk, and her face did the smallest possible thing. A tightening at one corner of the mouth, a sideways flick of the chin that said, "Come around back," without involving a single spoken word. Wren came around back. The kitchen door stood propped open with a chunk of stove wood. The heat coming out of it carried the smell of baking lard cornmeal, the iron and salt scent of a griddle that had been in continuous service since before Wren was born. Hedda shut the door behind them, dropped the bar, turned to look at her. The look of a woman conducting an inventory who did not care whether the subject of the inventory noticed. "Sit," Hedda told her, and Wren sat on a 3-legged stool near the stove, and Hedda put in front of her a chipped enamel plate carrying 2 eggs, a strip of fatback, a heel of cornbread coffee black enough to stand on its own authority. Wren looked at the plate. She had not eaten since the previous morning. She understood with the small shock of a person newly reminded that she was extremely hungry. "Eat first," Hedda told her. "Then we talk." She ate slowly, the way her mother had insisted fever patients eat small portions, unhurried, nothing the body hadn't been asked to accept. When the plate was clean, Hedda took it away without comment, set a damp cloth in front of her for her hands. Only then did she speak. Pryor had stopped at the inn at first light, Hedda said. Took a cup at the counter, told her he had ridden the road east and found no trace of Wren. He had not looked at Hedda when he said it, which meant one of three things: he had found sign and chosen not to share it. He had not looked with the attention a sheriff ought to bring to such a search. Or he was a worse liar than any man his age had earned the right to be. Which was it? Wren considered for exactly one breath. Then she told Hedda the truth because she had decided on the walk down the mountain that Hedda Greer would be the second person she trusted in Millhaven, or the last person she trusted anywhere, and there was no advantage in spending that trust slowly. She told her about the shale patch, the cedar root, the fissure, the stone stove she had found already built inside the mountain. She did not yet tell her about the diary that was a thing to keep behind her ribs until it was asked for. She told her that she intended to stay through the winter. She laid out the arithmetic of 250,000 calories in the flat tone of a woman reading a balance sheet to a business partner. She told Hedda she was going to need work, and that she needed it in a form that did not require Hedda to lie to the sheriff, to Cole Danner, or to the wives of any deacons at the Methodist church. Hedda listened without interrupting. When Wren finished, Hedda sat down on a bench by the flower bin, folded her hands in her lap, studied the ceiling for the count of 10 while she ran her own private calculation. Then she looked at Wren with the directness of a woman who has decided. 4 hours a day, Hedda told her. Pots, floors, the ash bucket. 50 cents in coin at the end of each shift off the books out of Hedda's own pocket. No ledger entry. Meals while she was on the premises, what the drovers left behind when they pushed back from the counter. She was to come in the back door before 5 o'clock, leave by the back door before 9. She was not to speak to the customers. The customers were not to speak to her. If Cole Danner walked through the front door, she was to be in the pantry with the door closed. She was not to come out until Hedda knocked twice. Was this an arrangement a woman in Wren's situation could accept? It was, Wren said. Hedda nodded once, the way a signature lands on a contract that both parties understand cannot be broken, stood up, lifted a stiff canvas apron from a peg by the door, handed it across. The day's work began without further ceremony. The cast iron at the Blue Elk Inn had been absorbing a decade of bacon grease and scorched onion, and it showed. Wren scrubbed with sand lye soap the wire brush Hedda kept in a jar of vinegar under the sink. Her hands, already abraded from the cliff, moved past raw into a condition that no longer had a comfortable name. She wrapped them in cotton strips at the end of the shift, without looking at what she was wrapping because looking would not accelerate the healing. She swept the plank floor, emptied the ash bucket into the pit behind the outhouse, scraped the griddle, scoured the coffee pot with fine gravel because Hedda held that soap corrupted the next pot's flavor and on this point was not open to debate. She worked invisible. The drovers who came in at 9 for coffee saw a woman in an apron behind a swinging door and filed her under furniture, which was precisely where she needed to be filed. At 5 minutes past 8, Hedda pressed 2 quarters into her palm, along with a folded copy of the Millhaven Courier. She mentioned addressing her cornmeal batter that Otto Fenwick's Dry Goods received a shipment Tuesdays that day. Old bread went to half price at 3 in the afternoon, that the tannery on the north end burned its hide scraps Thursday evenings, but sometimes released a bundle on Wednesday afternoons to the right kind of undemanding visitor. She also mentioned in the same tone that a woman named Bess Crane on Sycamore Lane had a husband down with joint fever and 3 shirts needing their collars turned that Bess paid in eggs, plus the considerable currency of never asking questions, which was this season's finest medium of exchange in Millhaven. Wren took the quarters. She took the newspaper. She stepped out the back door of the Blue Elk at 8 minutes past 9 and entered the routine that would hold with small variations for the next 20 consecutive days. Otto Fenwick was 64, thin as a pump handle, white beard cut to a point, spectacles balanced at the end of his nose with the authority of a small private judiciary. He looked up when she came in, studied her for a full moment over the top of the lenses, set down his account book, came around the counter, turned the front door lock with a brass key on a chain around his neck. Only then did he face her with a nod that was neither greeting nor question, but a form of professional acknowledgement between two people who understood each other's position without needing to articulate it. She spent her first 50 cents with the precision of a woman who has already done the math and knows there is no room in it for sentiment. 12 pounds of coarse rye flour, 2 pounds of dried pinto beans, 1 pound of rendered lard in a labeled tin, a quarter pound of salt, a tin of sulfur matches to replace what she had opened, a small twist of black tea cheaper than coffee and more forgiving in how it stretched. She left by the back door. Otto had held it open without being asked, with 16 pounds of dry goods in her arms. The tannery proprietor, a man named Dowd, who had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a fleshing blade in 1879, did not lift his eyes from the hide he was working when she asked about scraps. He pointed with the stub of his index finger at a pile of trimmings by the burn barrel. Anything smaller than a saucer she was welcome to take. If she came by Wednesday afternoons at 4, the softer pieces would be on top of the pile without any particular explanation being required. She thanked him. He grunted. She left with 3 pounds of soft cowhide trimmings that would, she calculated, insulate half of one wall of the chamber if she cut them correctly. At the grain warehouse behind the depot, the freighter on the loading dock, a broad-faced man named Grady, whose left ear had been taken by frostbite in a January she remembered by its particular misery, did not lift his eyes from the manifest he was tallying when she appeared. He mentioned into his paperwork that any jute sack bearing a torn seam was a sack the railroad declined to pay him to ship back to Denver. That a sack in that description sitting on the ground beside the dock was, in his private theological opinion, a sack that Providence had released from all prior obligations. She counted 11 jute sacks with torn seams on the ground beside the loading dock. She took all 11, folded them flat, rolled them into a bundle she tied with her own twine, left the depot at 10 past noon carrying more than she could comfortably see over. She did not go straight back to the fissure. She went first to Sycamore Lane, to the narrow clapboard house with the green shutter hanging loose on its top hinge, knocked at the back door with her elbow because her hands were full. Bess Crane, 35 years old, her face worn down to the essential bone structure by too much wind at too young an age, opened the door with the expression of a woman who has recently been given a rope. She produced 3 linen shirts with the collars gone through at the fold, a paper of pins, a spool of thread, 1 soft-boiled egg still warm from the pot. Wren took all of it, sat on the back step in the pale noon sun, turned the collar on the first shirt in 11 minutes flat. Bess stood in the doorway watching, because there was nothing that needed to be said between 2 women who had lost equivalent weight from the world in the same year, and they both understood this. When Wren handed back the first shirt finished, Bess pressed 4 more eggs into a scrap of newsprint, folded it around them, put it into Wren's free hand. Neither of them offered formal thanks. Some transactions carry the gratitude already folded inside them. She left Bess Crane's yard at 20 past 1 with 16 pounds of dry goods, 3 pounds of hide trimmings, 11 jute sacks, 5 eggs, a small piece of gingerbread that Bess's youngest boy had pushed into her hand at the gate without being told to. She walked the 3 miles back to the base of the Warden Peaks with her jaw set, because that load over that distance on frozen road was a punishment her body had not been asked to absorb since the summer she helped her father run the transit line up the Marias River when she was 16. The climb that first day took 4 hours going up. The rope system she had rigged was not yet adequate. The route she would eventually know by reflex had not yet been cut into the cliff face. The understanding had not yet come to her that a load could be broken into 2 smaller lifts and hauled up the final 50 vertical feet through the mechanical advantage of the pulley system she had found in the second chamber, the system she would discover on the 3rd day, wrapped in tarred canvas behind a loose stone at shoulder height in the north wall, a 4-fold iron block and tackle that had been there waiting since Ruth Calloway left it. She did the first climb on her back, the last 100 feet on her hands and knees. When she pushed the bundles through the fissure ahead of her at 4 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, the light inside the chamber had already gone purple at the edges. Her lungs were performing their whistle at the top of every 3rd breath, and she had to sit with her back against the chamber wall for 4 minutes before she could trust her legs to carry her to the stove. That was the first day of 20. Each one cost more from her body than the last. Each one returned more to the chamber's stores than the one before. She kept the ledger and the blank pages at the back of Ruth's diary because that felt to her like a form of continuation the diary's author would have recognized as the right use of empty space. By the end of the second week, she had accumulated 48 pounds of rye flour, 31 pounds of dried beans, 11 pounds of rendered lard across 3 tins, 4 pounds of salt, 1 pound of black tea, 2 pounds of dried apples she had bought at discount because they had gone slightly gray at the skin, 6 pounds of jerked beef from a rancher named Halverson, who paid her in dried meat for turning 6 of his shirt cuffs a pint jar of Hedda's blackberry preserves that had appeared on the back stoop of the Blue Elk one morning with no note attached. From a widow named Mrs. Egan, whose son had died of typhoid in Billings in September, whose pantry was being reduced to essentials, she had received a full crock of sourdough starter, along with the instruction that it was to be spoken to kindly, a directive she followed without irony. She had 20 gallons of water in wooden buckets against the far wall, hauled in relays from a spring half a mile along the ridge that ran ice-free under a natural overhang through the middle of December in a normal year. She had a wood wall 5 feet deep, 7 feet high along the north side of the stove, cut from a lightning-struck stand of timber a quarter-mile south of her ridge, with an axe purchased from the pawnbroker on Front Street for 80 cents. She had 4 of the 11 jute sacks slid open and pinned to the walls with wooden pegs, whittled from kindling, forming a rough insulating layer between her body and the bare stone. She had a sleeping pallet raised 6 inches off the floor on scavenged pine slats, insulated beneath with dried cedar bark, and the hide trimmings from Dowd's tannery. The pulley system, once she had cleaned the rust from its sheaves with a turpentine rag, changed every calculation. The iron wheels still turned on their axles with a smoothness that spoke to quality of manufacture and the particular preservation power of dry cave air. A 4-to-1 mechanical advantage meant she could move 200 pounds up the cliff face for the same effort she had been spending on 50, provided she had both the standing block anchored at height and a second person managing the tension on the working line below. She had found the anchor point on the 7th day. A natural bollard of limestone on the ridge above the fissure, exactly where the map had marked it, the shape and approximate size of a hitching post grown straight out of the bedrock. From its top, she could see 30 miles of open country in 3 directions, the wagon road from Millhaven to the county seat, unspooling below like a thin, pale thread dropped across the valley floor. From there, she understood what Ruth had meant by watch, and outplaced at 2 separate points on the ridgeline. The first was where a person could see who was coming from any direction. The second was the hidden exit route, the way a person could leave the ridge without being visible from the road below. She set the upper block at the bollard, ran the working line down through the fissure to the anchor spikes she had driven into a wall crack in the chamber, tested the system with the trunk. The trunk traveled the last 50 vertical feet of the cliff face in 9 minutes at the cost of a rope burn along her forearm. She sat on the ridge with the trunk beside her, and permitted herself one small, spare smile. It was not the smile of a woman who had beaten the mountain. It was the smile of a woman who had finally understood the terms the mountain was offering. On the 18th day, at 11 minutes past 10 in the morning, she walked into Otto Fenwick's Dry Goods for the last of her scheduled supply runs and found Cole Danner standing at the counter. He had his back to her. He was examining the label on a can of coal oil, holding it up toward the front window light the way a man holds something. He is not really reading, performing the act of reading it for an audience he had already identified by sound. Beside him, Vivian Ashby was running her fingers along a bolt of red wool flannel with an appraiser's attention, the kind of look that catalogs texture, weight, dye quality, and resale value in a single slow pass. Outside the front window, a loaded wagon sat at the rail, the Chicago pattern parlor stove with its nickel fretwork on the door, 2 crates of coal oil, bundled blankets, dressed beef in muslin, canned fruit stenciled in black, the live goose in its slat cage regarding Front Street with the flat moral authority of a creature that has resigned itself to the general unreasonableness of the world. Otto behind the counter made the smallest possible movement of his head toward the back door, the gesture of a man offering a quiet exit to someone who had not yet asked for one. Wren let him see her decline it. She stepped up to the counter, set down her 3 items with the deliberate ease of a woman who has nowhere she needs to be. A tin of waxed sulfur matches a stoppered bottle of coal oil for her lamp, a 10-pound sack of coarse cornmeal. The sound of the tin on the counter turned Cole around. He turned slowly in the way of a man whose peripheral instinct had already informed him who was standing there. His expression when it arrived on his face was not what she had prepared herself for. She had readied herself for surprise or for shame or at the outside for the particular flat control she had watched him use on the morning he had put her out. What she saw instead was small but unmistakable pleasure, not large pleasure. The pleasure of a man handed an unexpected minor entertainment on a morning that had not promised him one. He had heard, he said, addressing the general direction of the tinware shelf, that she had gone toward Chugwater. He had heard from Pryor that the road east had not been able to hold her. But here she was on the plank floor of Otto's establishment buying matches in a coat that had seen better seasons. Was she sleeping in a barn somewhere? Had she found herself a nice horse blanket by the fire at some drover camp? He was curious. A man liked to know what had become of the people who had depended on his generosity. The word generosity did exactly what he intended it to do. It made Otto look down at the polished wood of the counter. It made the two women examining yard goods 3 feet away go still. It made Vivian permit herself the smallest satisfied expression she had displayed all morning. Wren did not answer in the first beat or the second. She looked at the tin of matches, at the coal oil, at the cornmeal sack. Then she looked at Cole Danner with the unhurried consideration of a woman examining a length of wet leather, deciding whether the material is worth salvaging. Her voice, when it came, had the same level quality it had carried the morning she set the 2 tin cups on the porch rail. "Cole, I don't know anything about the people who depended on your generosity. I've never met one. But I would encourage you to have the flue on that Chicago stove inspected before you put fire in it. Cast iron of that gauge from Eastern foundries has been running dangerously hot in cold country installations this year. My father wrote extensively before he died about chimney fires in the North Platte settlements from that exact foundry pattern 6 houses in a single January. If your flue isn't properly drafted and lined before you use that stove, you and your intended will spend Christmas breathing their own smoke if they spend Christmas at all." She let the words settle onto the polished wood beside her purchases. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean toward him. Then she turned her attention half an inch toward Vivian Ashby, toward the woman who had stood on her porch in kid gloves, and smiled the smile that expected no reply. "Ma'am, if you have any influence with the man you've decided to marry, I'd encourage you to send for a chimney man out of the county seat before that stove is fired. It's a modest expense that could preserve your life. I mention it only because I understand you were raised in a good house, and a good house is a thing worth the effort of protecting." Vivian for the first time turned her head fully. Her color had shifted to a shade she did not wear well. She did not answer because answering would have required acknowledging that a woman in a mended flannel shirt had just addressed her not as a rival, but as an adult in need of practical household counsel, and Vivian Ashby at 10 in the morning in a dry goods store in Millhaven was not prepared to receive practical household counsel from anyone. Wren placed a 50-cent piece on the counter, nodded to Otto, picked up her 3 items, slid them into the burlap sack from inside her shirt, walked to the front door at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, stepped onto the plank sidewalk, turned west toward the base of the Warden Peaks, without looking back through the window. There was nothing behind that glass she needed to see again. In the store she had left, Cole Danner stood at the counter for 1 beat too long without speaking. Vivian turned back to the red wool flannel with a harder set to her mouth than she had carried all morning. Otto Fenwick, without lifting his eyes from the counter, made a careful notation in his account book, the kind of entry a precise man makes when he wants a particular fact to be available later to whoever might need it. The storm arrived the way she had read it, arriving the false clarity. First the world looking too sharp for 2 days before the front came through. Then the bruised iron wall rising off the western ranges, then the veil of heavy precipitation draped below the leading edge. The barometer Otto had lent her, a small brass instrument, with a flat glass tube, dropped a full point overnight, dropped another 2 points by the afternoon. She came in from her final town run. She climbed to the ridge one last time with the morning's firewood, stood on the bollard, looked west, saw the lightning inside the belly of the front. Dry lightning in November meant a colder air mass traveling behind the visible storm, the kind of colder mass that turned a hard winter into a punishing one. She sealed the fissure from the inside. The oilcloth cover she had prepared weighted with flat stones in pockets she had cut for them, wedged at the top edge with 2 additional stones jammed into the rock crack above. It would not satisfy a builder. It would stop the wind-driven snow from packing against the entrance, and that was the only standard that mattered. She fed the stove, checked the flue, sat on the pallet with the diary open in her lap reading the last entry for the 15th or 20th time because she had come over 3 weeks to treat it as a form of grace before sleep. Outside, the wind found the fissure and began to speak through it, first a low, wide hum, then a sharper note as pressure built, then a sustained keening that came through the canvas and the stone as a thin whistle at the edge of hearing. The stove answered it with a cheerful, indifferent crackle. She was reading by lamplight at 9:09, reviewing the entries about Ruth's first winter on rabbit fat and necessity, when a sound arrived through the fissure that was not a wind sound. She sat up, held her breath. The whistle at the fissure changed pitch, then beneath it distinctly the sound of a child crying. Low warned the particular quality of crying that is given up on being heard. She set the diary aside. She took the lamp. She crossed the chamber to the passage at the back, lowered herself onto her stomach, looked into the second chamber with the lamp extended. In the wavering circle of yellow light pressed into the far corner behind the Dutch oven, Ruth had left in the larder was a small figure with a threadbare blanket pulled around shoulders no wider than a 12-year-old's. A pair of dark eyes catching the lamp the way eyes catch light in the dark, direct animal terrified. A face she had not expected to see in the context of her own life or any other. The boy did not move. He was too cold to move. He was too frightened to move. He had, in the particular terrible arithmetic of his own recent history, determined that stillness was the safest available response to whatever entered his space with light. Wren set the lamp on the floor of the passage between them. She spoke quietly in the same level voice she had used with the sheriff with Hedda with Cole Danner on the floor of the dry goods store that morning, the voice her mother had used when removing a deep splinter from the palm of a child who did not yet trust her. "You're welcome to stay by my fire. Nobody in this chamber is going to send you back to any place you ran from. My name is Wren. What's yours?" The wind above them threw itself against the mountain with fresh weight. The oilcloth at the fissure creaked in its stones. The fire in the stove spoke into the small silence between the two of them, as though it had been holding its place all this time, waiting to serve as witness to whatever the two of them were about to become to each other. His name came in stages, the way trust comes in stages. The first night he offered only the English piece of its still water in a voice so abraded from weeks of disuse that she understood he had not spoken aloud to another living person in close to a month. The second night, after she had put a bowl of rye porridge with lard and a spoonful of Hedda's blackberry preserves into his hands, after she had watched him eat it, with the slow, careful discipline of a boy who had been taught that hunger was a private matter, he gave her the whole of it. His name in his own language, the syllables placed on the air with the gentleness of someone setting something irreplaceable on a high shelf. He was 12. His mother had died in the spring of 1883. His father the following winter. He had been placed by the Bureau on a train east in the September of 1884 with 14 other boys he had not known before to the school in Pennsylvania. He had lasted 11 months. He had left on a Sunday morning in August through a laundry yard, worked his way back west along the rail lines, riding under tarps in cattle cars once for 3 days in the false floor of a covered wagon driven by a preacher who hummed hymns and asked nothing. He had found his way to the base of the Warden Peaks by following a game trail up the shale face 2 days before the storm arrived, because the sky had told him what it told everything, living on the plains that week, that something was coming that would not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty in the matter of shelter. Wren did not ask him what he had eaten on the road. The answer was visible in the architecture of his wrists. She fed him 3 times in that first day in small portions with the discipline her mother had applied to cholera patients recovering their digestion. Weak tea with a spoon of lard for the fat. Thin porridge for the gut. Watched him fall asleep sitting up against the chamber wall with the empty bowl still in his hands, then moved him carefully onto the pallet, covered him with the wool blanket Mrs. Egan had traded her for a mended shawl, stood over him for a moment with the lamp. She thought about the ash grove. She thought about how the ash grove was in one country and this sleeping boy was in another, and how a woman's heart was a strange, inconvenient instrument that did not consult her before deciding what to do with rooms she had spent 2 years keeping empty. He was at the stove before her the next morning, feeding kindling, with a competence that told her wood fires had been part of his life before fire became something he had to find on the run. She said nothing about it. A boy who takes initiative on his first morning in a stranger's house does not need to be praised for it. He needs to be trusted to continue. She poured them both tea, sat down across from him, laid out for him in the same tone she had used with Hedda across the kitchen bench the terms of the arrangement she was proposing. He would stay through the winter. That was not a subject for negotiation. She would not put him back on the mountain in November under any circumstances. He would help with the work, the firewood, the water relay from the ridge spring, the rope management on the pulley system. She was still refining. He would sleep in the second chamber, which she would fit out for him properly, because a person needed a room of one's own to prevent the mind from folding in on itself. In exchange, she would teach him whatever he wanted to learn, reading if he wanted it, numbers, if he wanted them, the names of the herbs in her mother's receipt book if those interested him. She would not use any of the words for what he was that the men who had put him on the eastbound train had used. She would not ask him to answer to the English name if he preferred his own. If he wanted to use a different name on a different morning, she would use it without noting the change. He looked at her across the tin cups for a long measuring moment. Then he asked her in the careful, precise English of a boy who had been forced to acquire it whether she would send him back if the sheriff came up the mountain. No. Whether she would send him back if the storm broke and there were men on the road below asking questions about a boy matching his description. No. Whether she would send him back if the men on the road were offering money. She understood from the specific way he asked this last question that it had already happened to him at least once. She told him no. She told him that she would put a bullet in the chamber entrance before she would put him on any train heading east. That if he required evidence of this, she would show him the Colt in the trunk that afternoon, that she would teach him to use it before dark. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded once, precise, the size of a man's nod in a body that had not yet grown into the gesture. He drank the rest of his tea. The arrangement was in effect. The storm ran 12 days. Without pause for the first 4, without mercy for the middle 6, with a deceptive softness for the final 2 that she recognized as the storm attempting to smooth its own record. She had banked for 8 days and built margins for 12, so by the last of them she was rationing tea, stretching the lard, watching the flour level with the attention she had once given to the barometer. Stillwater spent the storm's interior days making careful maps in the blank pages at the back of the ledger maps of country she did not recognize, drawn with the concentration of a person working from memory. She did not ask him to explain. She understood that some things a person draws for themselves. They kept the fire small in daylight hours and larger in the coldest stretch before dawn. They cleaned the flue twice daily by striking the chimney pipe with the axe handle, at which a fall of pale soot would sift down onto the stovetop. Stillwater swept it into the ash bucket without being reminded. They maintained basic hygiene with a basin, a rag, 1 square of yellow soap she had divided into 6 portions to last the season. Her mother's method from the diphtheria week adapted for a cave instead of a sick room. They ate twice daily and slept early because sleep was a form of caloric preservation, because talking consumed from the same reserves as walking, and they talked anyway. On the 5th night, with the wind at a pitch that made the oilcloth seal creak like a barn door in a summer squall, Stillwater asked about the diary. She had been reading it by lamplight, and he had been watching her read it from his spot near the stove. She read him passages: the finding of the fissure, the building of the stove, the raid on the corn crib in the January thaw, the spring. She did not read him the last 3 entries immediately. She was not certain how a boy of 12 would receive the account of a woman escaping a dangerous situation by walking out of a mountain and going north alone in September, because the shape of that story was the shape of his own recent experience, and she did not want to hand him a template before he had finished deciding who he was. He asked on the 7th night whether there were more entries. She read him the last ones. She watched his face while she read. When she finished, he sat very still, looking at the stove for some time. Then he told her that his mother had once said before illness took her voice that people who leave are sometimes not lost, but only walking toward something. Wren wrote that sentence down in the ledger the same night in the section she had begun keeping for things that deserved to outlast the occasion of their saying. The 8th day brought their first real conflict. The storm had shifted direction in the middle of the night, driving snow directly against the fissure cover, building a drift that was beginning to strain the top anchor rope. She could hear the canvas under load, a sound between creaking and moaning that had a frequency suggesting structural failure within the hour. Without adequate airflow through the fissure, The chamber's CO would build to a level that rendered the stove more dangerous than the cold. She told Stillwater she would tie herself to the anchor spikes, go out through the fissure, clear the drift with the axe handle. His response arrived in a tone she had not yet heard from him: no. He would go. She was heavier and would fall harder if the rope didn't hold. She was also the one who knew how to get them both out of this mountain in the spring, which made her the one whose survival was non-negotiable. He was lighter. He could move through the fissure without stressing the upper anchor. He weighed 65 pounds, he told her flatly, and the rope would hold 65 pounds. She looked at him for a full, deliberate moment. Then she rigged the rope for his weight and stood at the fissure with the standing end wrapped twice around her forearm, and she counted under her breath while he went out into the wind with the axe handle. The count reached 94 before he came back through. He had snow in his hair, a scrape along the back of one hand that she wrapped in cotton before she made him drink tea with the last of the honey she had brought from Bess Crane's kitchen 2 weeks earlier. His face, as she bandaged his hand, held the particular expression of a boy who has just discovered in the middle of a serious storm that someone trusts him to do serious things. She wrote his sentence in the ledger that night: I weigh 65 pounds, so the rope will hold. She thought it belonged to him and ought to be preserved accordingly. The fire at the Danner homestead began on the 5th day of the storm, reconstructed later by Pryor as approximately 3 in the morning. The new Chicago parlor stove had been fired without any chimney inspection, because Vivian Ashby had elected to treat advice offered by a woman with a tin of matches on a dry goods counter as beneath the dignity of her position. The flue draft was insufficient for the stove's output. The coals Cole had banked before retiring ran too hot through a chimney that had never once been swept in the years he had owned the house. Creosote deposits in the upper section where the flue passed through the roof line caught at roughly 2:40 in the morning. Vivian smelled the smoke before Cole did. She had not yet allowed herself to sleep deeply in a house she still counted as provisional. She dressed in 9 minutes, gathered the items of established value, a pocket watch, a cameo brooch, the deed she had persuaded Cole to sign the previous week, transferring 40% interest in the beef cattle to her name against the future value of her father's purported holdings. The strong box from the front parlor containing $832 in $20 gold pieces Cole had drawn from the county bank the Friday before preparation for the Christmas wedding he had been planning since October. She woke Cole. She told him the house was burning. She walked out the front door, hitched the sleigh, drove it east at a speed that did not suggest the fire had surprised her, nearly as much as it would have surprised someone who had not spent an evening watching a badly drafted stove throw sparks against a flue she had never intended to have inspected. Cole went out through the back porch in his union suit, one boot on an arm across his face against the smoke. He tried to reach the horses in the barn. The barn had not yet caught. He got 2 out saddled. The third pulled loose in the yard, ran toward the timber, took his own direction on the question of survival. He mounted the second horse, rode west in the dark because in the firelit confusion he had misread the direction of the sleigh tracks. It took him the better part of an hour to understand he was going the wrong way, turn around, find the crossroads, find the tracks going east, and by that point the sleigh was 4 miles ahead of him, on the road to the county seat, being driven by a woman who had no intention of being caught. He rode east because Cheyenne was east, because the woman he had believed was going to reorganize his life into something worth waking up for had reorganized his money into something portable and left. He rode with the specific fury of a man who has confused his own poor judgment for someone else's betrayal. He did not stop to reprovision. He had a canteen of whiskey, a canvas coat over his union suit, a horse whose right rear pastern had been tender for 2 days that he had decided not to address on the grounds that a horse with a limp was better arithmetic than no horse at all. The storm caught him fully on the 2nd day of his ride. He lost the road twice in the first afternoon. He camped under a cut bank of the river the first night with a fire he could not sustain longer than 20 minutes at a stretch. On the second morning he rode in a direction he could no longer fully trust because the storm had disoriented his sense of the land's relationship to the compass, and he had not brought his compass because he had not believed he would need it. By the 6th day of the storm, when Pryor had assembled enough men in Millhaven to mount a serious search, Cole Danner had been missing for 4 days. Pryor rode to the homestead on the 3rd day, found the ruin of the house, found no bodies in the ash, found the sleigh tracks going east, found a scrap of paper in the scorched parlor wreckage that told him what Vivian Ashby had taken with her when she left. understood immediately from the specifics of what she had taken that her name was almost certainly not Vivian Ashby, that Cole Danner was somewhere alone in a blizzard on a horse with a bad leg, and that the situation had the structure of a thing that could not end cleanly. On the seventh day, Pryor led 4 riders out along the wagon road, east then west, then along the base of the Warden Peaks in the last light of the afternoon, coal oil lanterns swinging from their saddle horns calling Cole's name into a wind that returned it without particular interest. None of them thought to look up. If they had, they might have noticed on the ridge above the fissure a thin thread of smoke. The smoke Wren allowed to escape from the flue only at dawn and dusk, when the sky was a color that could absorb it. They did not look up. They rode east. They rode west. They came back on the 8th, 9th, 10th days of the storm in widening arcs, and they found nothing. Cole Danner by the 10th day had circled back across his own tracks 3 times without knowing it. He was within 1.5 miles of the base of the Warden Peaks, riding slow, blind loops through the timber south of the wagon road, his horse's pastern deteriorating with each hour the animal put weight on it. On the 11th night of the storm, past midnight, the horse put his foreleg into a drift-covered hole in the ground, went to his knees with a crack that any man who had ridden horses for 20 years could not have mistaken for anything but what it was. Cole was thrown clear. He hit the trunk of a fallen cedar with the sound of a body that has been traveling too fast for the landing. His right forearm broke against a knot at the tree's shoulder. His right hip absorbed the impact of the fall. The horse screamed in the specific register of an animal that knows something has gone permanently wrong until Cole, with his left hand shaking hard, managed to unholster the pistol at his belt. It took 3 shots. Then Cole sat in the snow beside the horse. He sat because he could not stand. His forearm had moved from agony to a dull, ringing absence that he recognized somewhere beneath the shock as a bad sign. He did not have enough presence of mind left to be afraid of dying. He sat in the snow and felt the cold begin the specific work of pulling heat from his core in the way that killed men before it froze them. And he began distantly to understand what was happening. Wren was reading the ledger by lamplight. Stillwater was asleep in the second chamber. The stove maintained its low, steady conversation with itself. She was midway through the month's caloric projection when the sound came through the fissure, a horse's scream carrying under it the particular desperation of an animal that knows it is past help. She set the ledger down. She heard it again, closer, carrying beneath it the shape of a human voice, raised in what the wind tore before she could make out words. Then 3 pistol shots in the spacing of a man performing a last mercy with a shaking hand. Then the muffled percussion of a body against wood. Then silence. She stood at the fissure with the lamp in her hand for the full measure of a minute, calculating the distance the sound had traveled the terrain between the cliff base and the road, the number of minutes a man could survive at the current external temperature without moving. The number she arrived at was 18. 18 was not enough for her to rig the pulley dress for the descent, lower herself to the road, find a man in a snowdrift by the sound of her own breathing. 12 was enough if the descent equipment was already prepared, which it was, and if she had a second person at the upper anchor to work the standing line. She turned from the fissure. Stillwater was already awake in the second chamber, propped on one elbow with a blanket around his shoulders, his eyes catching the lamplight exactly as they had caught it on the night she first found him. He had heard the shots. He had reached the same conclusion she had in the same breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was thinner than it had been in her possession of it. "There's a man at the bottom of the cliff. He will freeze to death in 12 minutes. If I go for him, I need you at the anchor line. If I bring him up and he turns out to be someone I am not glad to see, I will bring him up regardless, because a person dying at the foot of a cliff has stopped being any particular person. They have become only a person. We do not have the luxury of deciding in advance who they were before the cold got them." Stillwater was pulling on his socks before she finished the sentence. He was tightening his belt before she reached the fissure. He did not ask her what she meant by someone I am not glad to see. He had learned the shape of that kind of sentence and understood it did not require explanation. She dressed for the wind. 2 flannel shirts, the sheepskin vest she had traded Mrs. Egan for a rewritten Bible in the second week of the storm, the canvas coat over both a wool muffler she had knitted during the storm's 5th day when her hands needed a task to stop them from shaking. She wrapped her boots in strips of jute to slow the leather's surrender to the cold. She took the axe, the rope coil, the small tin lantern hooded on 3 sides, a folded blanket, because a body found in a drift needed to be wrapped before it was moved, or the wrapping would fail at exactly the moment the body reached the fissure and needed the most. She looked at Stillwater one last time. He was crouched at the standing block, hands already on the rope, feet braced against the anchor spikes. She told him 3 sharp pulls meant start hauling. 2 long meant stop and hold. 1 meant take up slack. He was not to come out through the fissure, regardless of what he heard. The rope held either her or it held nothing. Either way, he stayed at the block. "Yes," he said, 1 word sufficient. She went out through the fissure into the wind, and the wind received her, the way wind receives a person on a cliff ledge at night in November, without ceremony, without mercy, without any acknowledgement that the person had done anything remarkable in order to be there. She went down the descent line in controlled arrests 80 feet to the road, the snow at the base of the cliff already thigh-deep. She stood in the dark with the lantern shielded against her chest, listening. A sound to the north, 40 yards no more. She moved toward it. Each step cost a full breath. Her lungs were already beginning the particular negotiation they conducted under extreme demand, the whistling tightening at the top of each inhale. She chewed the mint leaves from her coat pocket as she pushed through the drift, feeling the small, useful margin of airway that mint bought her, knowing she was spending reserves she would need on the ascent. The horse was already still, neck folded at an angle that required no further assessment, a dark stain in the snow beside its head. 6 feet from the horse, half buried, lay the man. She unhooded the lantern, lowered it toward his face. She had prepared herself for the possibility that it would be Cole Danner. She had prepared herself with the specific discipline of a woman who has spent 3 weeks in a stone room learning to keep emotion on the correct side of a decision. What she had not prepared for, could not have prepared for, was what the sight of his face did to her chest. Not pity, not vindication. Something closer to grief, which was not an emotion she had allocated space for in the ledger of her survival. She permitted herself 2 full breaths of it. Then she put it in the same internal storage as the sheepskin coat, the pewter thimble, the ash grove, sealed it there for later, and got to work. He was in the last phase of cold exposure, the still phase, the one her mother had called the apathetic hour. Not shivering, not curled. On his side, with his eyes half open, breathing in the shallow, indifferent rhythm of a person for whom breathing had started to feel like a suggestion rather than a requirement. She wrapped the blanket around him twice, pulled the corners tight across his chest, tied them with a length of rope, rolled him onto his back. Cut the frozen canvas coat away from his body with her pocket knife because the coat had become a shell that would only impede movement. She looped the bowline under his arms. She stood, gave 3 sharp pulls on the standing line, felt the tension rise through the rope as Stillwater put his weight on it at the anchor above. She began the work of walking her side of the double line back along the base of the cliff, while the mechanical advantage at the top did what 4 generations of engineering had designed it to do, moved a weight the direct application of human muscle alone could not have moved. It worked. It worked because Ruth Calloway had purchased that block and tackle in Denver in 1874. It worked because the map on the ridge had shown the bollard. It worked because a 12-year-old boy had chosen to weigh 65 pounds exactly when 65 pounds was what was needed. It worked because 3 weeks of preparation had been in ways she had not known while doing it, preparation for this specific night. 91 minutes. She counted them in groups of 10 to keep her lungs honest. 2 full stops, her lungs failed her twice at the cliff base, each time requiring her to sit in the snow and force air down into the floor of her chest with the mint leaves until the whistling narrowed to a workable frequency. At the end, the final 10 feet of the ascent required her to climb the cliff face alongside the ropes and guide Cole's body through the fissure by hand, managing his shoulders through the passage's narrowest point with the same careful negotiation she had given her own trunk on the night she had first arrived. When she laid him on the chamber floor and told Stillwater to release the standing line, the boy sat back on his heels and was silent for a full minute. In the 11 weeks since he had walked out of that laundry yard in Pennsylvania, he had not been permitted to feel proud of a specific thing he had done with his own body and his own judgment. Now he was. The feeling was too large for the container available. She did not remark on his expression. She only wrapped his scraped hand in fresh cotton, made him tea with the honey. They had finished the previous week. She found one more spoonful at the bottom of the jar she had missed, wrote his sentence in the ledger again, this time underlining it, because some sentences earned emphasis not through repetition, but through the weight of what had been done to prove them. Cole Danner was not going to die in her chamber. She confirmed that within 20 minutes of hauling him through the fissure, working through the evidence the way her mother had taught her to work through a patient, checking each system in order, starting with the most urgent. She stripped the frozen coat remnants from his shoulders, hung them on the nails she had driven into the far wall, for drying purposes, wrapped him in the second wool blanket, plus the sheepskin vest she had lent Stillwater during the storm's coldest passage. She rubbed his hands with lard until the color came back in the sequence her mother's receipt book specified. She got a spoon of warm tea into him, then a second, then a third. He would, however, lose the tip of the smallest finger on his left hand. She could see that from across the chamber. The finger had gone wax yellow, the specific shade her mother's book named and described with clinical precision. And when she pressed the pad of her thumb against it, the tissue was hard in the way that announced itself without ambiguity. No quantity of warming would reverse what that finger had already become. His right forearm was broken in two places, the ulna clean through the radius green stick, both bones displaced under the swelling that had already begun to distort the sleeve she cut away with her knife. She would set it in the morning when he was warm enough to survive the pain of reduction. Tonight she splinted it against a split length of cedar, bound it with cotton strips cut from her spare chemise, fashioned a sling from the wool muffler she had knitted during the storm's 5th day, hung it from his neck. She sat back on her heels beside the pallet she had moved him to and looked at the man who had stood on the porch of a house she had made livable and used the word arrangement to describe 3 years of her life. He came fully awake between the 4th spoonful of tea and the 5th. His eyes found the chamber ceiling, moved to the jute sack walls, moved to the woodpile that was still, even after 12 days of storm, a wall of stacked cedar taller than his head. They found the stove. They found her. He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. Her voice carried the same level quality it had carried the morning she set the 2 tin cups on the porch rail, unhurried, without heat. The voice of someone who has already done the relevant accounting. You are not to speak yet. You are to drink what I give you. You are to lie still. When I permit questions, you will ask them in the order I choose, because I am the person in this chamber currently doing the arithmetic on whether you survive, and that arithmetic requires your cooperation. He nodded. She fed him tea for another 5 minutes, watching his color normalize, watching his breath deepen from the shallow indifference of near hypothermia into something that indicated his body had remembered. It had reasons to continue. Then she allowed him one question. He asked in a voice cracked to its foundations where they were. She told him the truth without softening it. He was in a chamber 60 feet up the west face of the Warden Peaks in a shelter built in 1874 by a woman he had never heard of, reprovisioned in October of 1885 by a woman he had put off a porch in the same month. If he attempted to leave before she deemed him capable of the descent, he would fall and die. If he stayed and cooperated with the conditions she was about to describe, he would be alive by spring. She listed the conditions. He would eat what she provided in the portion she chose. He would drink when she told him to drink. He would not under any circumstance address the boy in the second chamber except through her. He would not use the boy's name. He would not ask the boy any questions. He would not speak of the boy's existence to any person in Millhaven, in the county seat, or anywhere else in this territory, or beyond it in this life, or any arrangement of the afterlife he subscribed to. If the day arrived when he could not recall the boy's face, he should count that day as the beginning of his own personal reckoning with something like grace. If she discovered at any point during his recovery that he had violated any of these conditions, she would take her rope, lower him down the cliff face on a single line without the block, and let go at the bottom. She said this in the same tone she had used for the caloric projections. He understood she meant every syllable before she had finished the second condition. His face understood before his mouth did. On the second day of his presence in the chamber, he asked about Vivian. She had been expecting the question and had decided how to answer it, while she bandaged his hand that morning, not with softness, not with satisfaction, but with the plain factual delivery of information a person deserved to have about the consequences of their own choices. She told him what he had told her in his fever when he had been speaking to a woman he believed was his mother, his voice loose in the way that stripped it of calculation. He had told the fever woman that Vivian Ashby of Helena was not the daughter of any bank president she could locate because no woman by that name appeared in the records of the relevant family. That the story she had told him had been constructed from a template she had used at least twice before in other Montana settlements, that her real name was May Duval, that she had obtained 40% of his cattle by deed in the second week of November, and the family cameo and pocket watch by simpler means, and that on the night the chimney caught, she had driven his sleigh east with a strongbox containing $832 in gold coin. He had drawn from the bank the previous Friday, preparation for a wedding that was never going to happen, because the woman planning it had been planning her exit since before she arrived. Cole listened to this accounting of his own fever testimony with the expression of a man watching the structure of his self-deception being disassembled board by board. When she finished, he looked at the chamber wall for a long time. The wall was doing the work of holding him together, and she could see him letting it. Then he looked at his bandaged hand at the space below the smallest finger where the tip was already darkening toward what it would become, and without warning himself first he wept. Not quietly. With the particular ugliness of a man who has not cried since boyhood, and has consequently lost any fluency in it. She sat opposite him at the stove, and let him finish the way her mother had let patients finish the necessary work of a wound before proceeding to the treatment. She did not offer comfort. Comfort was not in the ledger. But she did not look away either, because looking away would have been a form of contempt she had decided she was not going to spend on him. When he was done, he asked her in a voice she had not heard from him in 3 years whether she could forgive him. She looked at him for a long, deliberate measure. "Forgiveness is not currently on the ledger," she told him. "The ledger is still open. I am still pricing what you cost me. What you took from me is not the ranch. What you took is the portion of my one life you asked me to spend on a floor you had already promised to someone else. I won't spend the winter counting it because I have other work. But you will not ask me to forgive the count until I have finished it." He did not speak again for the remainder of that afternoon. Stillwater came into the main chamber that evening, set a bowl of beans beside Cole's pallet without looking at him. Cole took the bowl without looking at Stillwater. Neither of them was rude. Neither of them was warm. Wren observed this truce achieved in silence on the second day of a stranger's presence, and judged it the maximum the chamber could structurally support that November. On the fourth day of Cole's presence in the chamber, with the storm fully broken and the wind reduced to the ordinary complaint of a normal winter night, she opened the ledger to a clean page, set it in front of him with a pencil, and dictated. He had committed fraud by intent when he filed the homestead deed under his name alone in 1882, knowing she believed the property to be jointly held. He had allowed her to invest 3 years of labor on that belief without correction. On the morning of October 14, 1885, he had evicted her from a property to which she held a valid, equitable claim under the doctrine of unjust enrichment in the presence of a peace officer of the county, while making a materially false statement regarding the ownership of a garment she had produced with her own hands from materials transferred to her use. He had subsequently entered into a marriage engagement with a woman he now had reason to believe had entered that engagement with fraudulent intent, and had in the course of that engagement allowed her use of ranch resources in a manner that had materially diminished the assets available to satisfy his prior obligations to Wren Calloway. He wrote it in his own hand. She corrected 2 sentences for clarity. Stillwater, sitting cross-legged near the stove, watched with the attentiveness of a boy, learning that adult reckoning could be conducted with a pencil as efficiently as with a rope. Cole signed at the bottom. She witnessed the signature. Stillwater, at her invitation, placed a careful mark beside her name, a mark that would not hold legal weight in any court in the territory, but that would hold its full weight in her private register of the world, which was, for the purposes of this chamber, the register that counted. She put the ledger back in the cedar box alongside Ruth's diary. She sat afterward for a long time, looking at the fire, thinking about the way a mountain could rearrange a person's understanding of what was permanent and what was merely debt. Stillwater beside her was carving a small piece of cedar, with the pocket knife she had lent him 3 days before, shaping it with the slow patience he brought to everything. When she looked at what was forming under his hands, she saw a small horse no larger than her thumb. Its head lowered, its mane flowing along the curve of its neck in the specific attitude of an animal running full into open country. He did not tell her who the horse was for. She did not ask. He placed it on the stone shelf above the stove when he was finished in the narrow space between the tin of matches and the jar of blackberry preserves. She understood, without needing the explanation spoken aloud, that he had made it for the mule at the bottom of the cliff. That a boy who carves a horse for a dead animal he has never seen has been paying closer attention to the woman who took him in than the woman had known while he was doing it. She lay late by the stove that night, the storm finally reduced to the ordinary breath of a mountain. At rest, the stars through the fissure canvas rolled back a hand's width to check the draft. The specific hard, clean stars available only after a long storm has scoured the sky of everything provisional. She could see 90 miles east the faint smudge of county seat lights against the horizon, small enough to cover with her thumbnail. She could see 3 miles west, 800 feet below the pale ribbon of the wagon road, and moving along it, the tiny orange points of coal oil lanterns. Pryor's search party, she now knew from Cole's own fever testimony, had been going out daily since the 7th day of the storm, looking for a man who had ridden east into a blizzard from the wreckage of his own house. She watched the small moving lights for a long time, thinking about the map on the ridge above her, about the 2 words Ruth had placed at 2 separate points along the ridgeline, and she understood with the clarity of a problem that has finally resolved itself, watch then out. Not a description of 2 dangers to avoid. A sequence, a direction of travel. Watch from the high point, then go out through the hidden exit when the road is clear. Ruth had not built a fortress. She had built a way station, a turning point, and had marked the door that led forward. She would go down in the morning. She would carry the confession in the inside pocket of her coat. She would bring Stillwater because leaving him alone in the chamber would frighten him in ways she was not willing to be the cause of. A boy who had learned to trust a woman with his name in the middle of a storm should not spend the first morning of the end of that storm in the same room where the storm had held him. She would bring Cole because Cole was the exhibit, because the evidence walked into Millhaven on its own 2 feet, or it had no weight in front of witnesses. She would bring Ruth's diary because a man in a marshal's coat was going to need the second half of a story before he could do the work she was about to ask of him. She banked the fire, checked the flue one final time, set water on the stove for morning tea. Then she sat beside Stillwater's pallet in the second chamber, watching his face in the low glow coming through the passage, thinking about what 12 looks like when it has survived its way to the other side of something large. She permitted herself one careful stroke of his hair with the back of her knuckles, the gesture her mother had used on her own hair on the last night in the house in Pennsylvania before the surveying work took her father west for good. Then she went back to the main chamber, blew out the lamp, lay down on her pallet with the ledger under her head. She had come over 6 weeks to prefer sleeping on the record of her own arithmetic to sleeping on any surface the town below had ever offered her. Morning came earlier than she had planned for. She was up before the light. Tea for 3. Rye porridge with lard jerked beef dried apple for each of them. She measured the portions with the precision she had maintained all season. Not because the stores couldn't spare the extra, but because the habit of precision was itself a form of survival. She was not ready to relinquish. She checked Cole's splint, retied the sling. She put the signed confession in an oilcloth packet inside her coat. She placed Ruth's diary in the cedar box, fitted the lid, packed the box with the last note from the second chamber tucked inside the front cover, placed there deliberately the night before so that the right person would find it in the sequence Ruth had intended. They went out through the fissure at 9:08 on the morning of December 1st, 1885. Wren first, then Stillwater, then Cole, whose descent required a second harness rigged from the tack rope so that he could be lowered on his good arm while the broken one rode in its sling against his chest. It took an hour to bring all 3 of them down the 80 feet to the shale road. Another 20 minutes walking east before the town came to meet them. The town came in the form of 6 mounted men led by Pryor riding west on the strength of a report from a rancher who had seen at first light a thread of smoke rising from the west face of the Warden Peaks and had ridden into Millhaven to say so with the specific caution of a man who had lived 20 years in this country and knew that smoke where smoke had no business being was always worth reporting. Pryor saw them first. He reined in so sharply his horse shied, put a hoof through a patch of ice, nearly went down on one knee. He sat on the animal for a full breath without speaking. Then he swung down, walked toward Wren across the frozen road at the pace of a man whose legs had known too much saddle to hurry, stopped 6 feet in front of her, removed his hat with the deliberate care of a man performing a meaningful gesture. "Wren Calloway," his voice barely holding its shape. "We buried your name 3 weeks ago in the Methodist church parlor. Reverend Ames gave the eulogy. Hedda Greer sang. There is a headstone in the Millhaven plot with your date on it that Otto Fenwick paid for out of his own pocket." She did not smile. She did not weep. She had moved beyond the point in her life where news of her own funeral carried the power to shift her in any particular direction. "Sheriff Pryor," her voice carrying the same quality it had the morning she set down 2 tin cups on the porch rail, "I have not yet died. I have brought you Cole Danner, reported missing on the 5th of November. I have also brought you a boy of 12 who is in my care, along with a signed confession addressing a fraud in the county recorder's office, plus a second matter I believe falls under federal jurisdiction. If there is coffee at the Blue Elk, I would drink a cup before speaking to anyone else." Pryor put his hat back on. He turned to the men behind him, issued 3 orders in the flat, efficient voice of a man who has just been handed 6 problems to solve simultaneously. 1 rider ahead to the Blue Elk to tell Hedda Greer to set 5 plates. 1 rider to the telegraph office to wire the federal marshal's office in the county seat, requesting immediate attendance of any available officer for matters involving fraud and probable arson. A 3rd man to dismount, give his horse to Cole. A 4th to give his horse to the boy. Pryor himself walked beside Wren the last mile into Millhaven on foot in the specific act of penance available to a lawman who understands he has already been forgiven for something he has not yet forgiven himself for doing. The town turned out in full. Every soul not confined to a sickbed or a schoolroom because word of smoke on the Warden Peaks had moved the way significant news always moves in a small place faster than any writer carried on the breath of everyone who heard it and immediately needed to tell someone else. Hedda Greer stood on the Blue Elk porch with a coffee pot in one hand and her rifle in the other. The rifle was not for Wren. It was for anyone in the gathered crowd who needed reminding whose porch this was. Otto Fenwick stood in the door of his dry goods with his account book held against his chest. Bess Crane stood at the corner of Sycamore Lane with both hands over her mouth. Mrs. Egan stood beside her, pressing a handkerchief to her face with the same cloth she had used to describe the sourdough starter. Wren walked past all of them. She walked to the Blue Elk porch, stopped at the bottom step, turned so that the assembled town could see her, so that Cole Danner on the horse behind her could be seen beside her by every man and woman who had ever bought a beef from his operation or passed him on Front Street on a Saturday morning. Her voice, when she addressed them, carried no particular volume. It did not need to. "This is Cole Danner. Some of you searched for him. He was where he had chosen to be, which was riding east into a blizzard after being robbed of his cattle deed, his personal valuables, and $800 in gold coin by the woman he introduced to this town as his intended wife. I found him at the base of the Warden Peaks on the night of the 24th of November. I brought him up into a shelter that has existed on that mountain since 1874. I kept him alive for 7 days. This morning I brought him down to answer to Sheriff Pryor, who will explain to the federal marshal upon his arrival the nature of the papers Cole Danner filed in the county recorder's office in 1882 regarding the homestead I lived on until this October. I have nothing further to say on this porch. I intend to eat breakfast. Questions go to Sheriff Pryor. Opinions keep until you've asked the questions." The town received this in the particular silence of a room in which the final piece of a long puzzle has been placed on the table. Not the silence of shock, the silence of people who have just had a shape confirmed that they had been sensing in fragments for weeks. Hedda Greer set the coffee pot on the porch rail, came down the steps, wrapped both arms around Wren without a word, held her for the count of 5, stepped back, wiped her own face with her apron, said in her ordinary kitchen voice that there were eggs on the griddle, a bench inside a boy who was going to be acquainted with a plate of fatback whether he'd encountered it before or not. Stillwater looked at Wren. She nodded. He followed Hedda up the steps, and something in the set of his shoulders, the slight release of a tension held so long it had stopped registering as tension, told her that whatever the next thing was going to be for him, it was going to begin in a kitchen that smelled of cast iron and cornmeal. Cole Danner sat on his borrowed horse with his good hand on the pommel, his broken arm in its sling, his face carrying the expression of a man who has been shown simultaneously the small mercy of not being dead and the very large public invoice for having believed himself untouchable. Pryor took the horse's reins. Pryor said nothing. He walked the horse toward the sheriff's office at a deliberate pace because the town was watching, because the pace of that walk was itself the first sentence of a document that was going to take the better part of 3 months to complete. The federal marshal reached Millhaven on the morning of December 4th. His name was Jonas Calloway. He was 41 years old, 6 years in the federal service in this territory, before that a deputy in Nebraska, before that a scout for the Army in the Powder River country. He wore a plain black coat over a gray suit, carried his sidearm in a shoulder holster because his sister had once told him in a letter, one of the last letters before the letter stopped, that a shoulder holster bound less in cold weather than a hip rig and that he ought to try one. He had carried the recommendation for 11 years. He had carried the memory of the recommendation longer than the memory of the letter itself. In the inside pocket of his coat, he carried a copy of the telegram that had reached his office the morning of December 2nd. Danner matter, Millhaven fraud, likely arson, probable interstate flight, witness Calloway come Pryor. He had come on the fraud. He had come also for a reason. He had not put in any report and would not put in any report because the address of the town matched the address of the last piece of correspondence he had ever sent that was not answered. And a man who had been not answering a particular question for 11 years did not pass up the opportunity to get closer to where the answer had last been seen. He arrived, took coffee at the Blue Elk counter without speaking to anyone, went upstairs to the room Hedda had prepared, put his saddlebag down, came back to the counter, found Pryor waiting with a stack of documents. Pryor introduced Wren, who was sitting 3 stools down with Stillwater beside her, the boy practicing columns of 3-digit figures in a ledger with a pencil stub held in his left hand because his right had stiffened overnight from the anchor work. Jonas Calloway looked at Wren. He nodded. He pulled his chair so he could address both her and Pryor without pivoting. He asked in a voice that did not carry past the counter what she had brought him. She brought him the confession first, then Otto Fenwick's account book notation from the 18th of October, which Otto had walked to the Blue Elk the previous evening, and left on the counter with the words, "This may be of use to someone," addressed to no one in particular. Then Pryor's written deposition from the previous afternoon. Then May Duval's real name, the description of the stolen sleigh, the probable destination, the estimated value of the goods removed. Then the fact of the Chicago stove installation, how it had been insisted upon, against Wren's recorded warning, how no chimney inspector had been called, because May Duval had never intended to be present for a second Montana winter. Otto could confirm this last point, she noted, because he had specifically declined to supply May with the name of an inspector, on the grounds that she had not requested one until conditions made sending for one impossible. Jonas listened without moving his hands from his coffee cup. When she finished the last item, he sat in a measuring silence. Then he asked one question. "You mentioned a diary. Is there a diary I should see?" She had been carrying the answer to this question since the night she first read Ruth's last entry. She had been carrying alongside it the particular tension of a person who suspects they are about to hand someone something irreversible. She reached into the pack at her feet, lifted out the cedar box, set it on the counter between them, opened the lid, lifted out the small brown calfskin book with the leather thong, set it in front of Jonas Calloway so that when he opened it, the name on the first page would be the first thing he encountered. He opened it, he read the name, his face held for one full breath. Then it did what faces do when a man has been maintaining a specific internal pressure for 11 years and does not know he is about to release it until the release has already begun. He placed the open book flat on the counter. He set both hands on either side of it as though to keep it from moving away. He did not look at Wren. He did not look at Pryor. He looked at the name written in faded brown ink and breathed out something he had not known was still waiting to be breathed. Ruth. His voice had gone thin at its edges. She was my sister. Wren waited. There was no useful sentence she could place into that particular space, and she had enough respect for what had just occurred not to attempt one. Stillwater beside her had set his pencil down. He was watching Jonas Calloway with the attentiveness he brought to all significant things, the attentiveness of a boy who had witnessed enough grief in his short life to recognize its specific shapes and know them for what they were. Jonas took his hands from the diary's cover. He touched the edge of the page with one fingertip lightly, The way a man touches something that has survived longer than he expected anything to survive. He turned to the second page. The third. He read the entries about the whip on the nail by the kitchen door. He read about the fissure, the stove, the first winter on Rabbit and Necessity. He read the September 1874 entry, in which Ruth had written about her Zeke, about her certainty that if he grew up to be the man she believed he could become, he would understand that a sister sometimes leaves not to abandon the one she loves, but to preserve herself for a future that might still include them. He stopped at that entry, pressed his palm flat over it, closed his eyes for the length of one slow breath, opened them, kept reading. He read through to the last entries, then to the folded note from the second chamber that Wren had tucked inside the front cover, the night before placed in sequence in the order Ruth had left things, so that he would receive them the way Ruth had intended them to be received by whoever came next. When he finished, he closed the book. He tied the leather thong. He sat with both hands on the closed cover for a long moment, and his eyes were dry in the specific way that eyes go dry when the weeping is taking place somewhere too deep for any witness to see. "She left this for me," he said at last, looking at Wren across the counter. "She left it for anyone. She left it in the deliberate belief that whoever found it would understand what she meant when she said she hadn't stayed away because of me." He looked at the book. He looked at Wren. "Miss Calloway, I am obliged to you in a way that is not customary for a federal officer to declare across a public counter. I am going to arrest Cole Danner this afternoon on the charge of fraud in the filing of a homestead deed. I am going to ride to the county seat tomorrow to put a warrant on the wire for May Duval, whom I have reason to believe I have encountered under a different name in a case out of Grand Junction. I am going to write tonight on my own time a letter to a woman who may or may not still be running a boarding house in the northern part of this territory, whose name I have been carrying in the particular quiet of a man who has not given up on a thing but has learned not to speak about it. That letter is not part of the record of this office. It is my own affair. I mention it only because you have handed me the second half of a story I have been living in the first half of for 11 years, and it seems to me that the person who hands a man a gift of that kind deserves at minimum the courtesy of knowing what he intends to do with it." She did not speak immediately. She looked at him. Then she reached across the counter, placed her hand on the cover of the diary, drew it back into her own keeping. "Marshal Calloway, write the letter tonight. Don't mail it in the morning. Wait a week. If your letter travels in the same postal pouch as your warrant for May Duval, it will be opened by the wrong clerk at the wrong desk before it reaches the right hands. A woman who has spent 11 years teaching herself not to answer to a name she loved will not have her privacy handed to a stranger before you've had the chance to hand it to her yourself. Wait until the warrant has done its work, then send the letter in its own envelope, then wait for an answer with the patience of a brother, not a marshal." Jonas Calloway looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. He turned to Pryor. He asked in his working voice whether the town had a space where he could set up a table for witness interviews that afternoon. Pryor said yes. The two men walked out of the Blue Elk together into the December light toward the small pine board building on 2nd Street that served on days when it was needed as the working office of any federal officer who found himself in Millhaven with paperwork to complete. They arrested Cole Danner at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He did not resist. He rose from the bench in Pryor's office, walked without speaking to the wagon that would carry him to the county seat, sat down in it with his broken arm in its sling against his chest, did not turn his head toward the people gathered on Front Street to watch him go. Wren did not go to the county seat. She stayed in Millhaven in the small back room Hedda had cleared for her and Stillwater at the Blue Elk. She stayed because the legal proceedings would take months to prepare, because Jonas Calloway had confirmed her presence was not required until the arraignment in March, because she had come over 6 weeks in a stone room to assign a specific and irreplaceable weight to a bed on the ground floor of Hedda's kitchen that no hotel in the county seat could match. They arrested May Duval, her real name confirmed by Jonas's wire to Grand Junction, where she had worked a nearly identical scheme on a rancher named Teller in the winter of 1883, in a rented room above a lace shop on a commercial street in the county seat on the 21st of December. The warrant reached the city on the 15th. The county police had been watching the lace shop for 4 days before the arrest because May Duval had made the specific mistake of paying her landlady in one of the $20 gold pieces from Cole's strongbox. The landlady, widowed the previous year by a railroad accident that had left her with a permanent suspicion of strangers paying in gold, had carried the coin to her brother-in-law who served on the city police. May was extradited to Millhaven jurisdiction on the 29th of December. She was tried in March and convicted of grand larceny, arson by criminal negligence, and interstate flight. Sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge, she would serve 6. Cole Danner's case moved more slowly, as civil fraud cases always did. Judge Harlan Whitmore, who had been on the bench for 13 years and held a particular distaste for the pattern of homesteaders who filed under one name while sharing their land with a woman under another, ruled in the first week of April that the deed was void for constructive fraud from its inception, that Wren Calloway held a valid equitable claim to 50% of the property's improved value as it had stood on the 14th of October, 1885, that the fire insurance policy Cole had taken out in 1884 would pay to the recorded owner of the property at the date of the fire, Cole Danner, but that Wren's equitable claim would attach to those proceeds at the moment of payment. The policy paid $4,200, Wren's share after the court took its costs, and Jonas arranged for her to work with a county seat attorney named Fitch, who reduced his fee for women who had come down off mountains, came to $1,960.20. She held the bank draft in her hands in the corridor outside the courtroom for a long moment without moving. It was more money than she had held in her life. It was less than the full ledger of what she had been given, because the full ledger included Ruth's diary, included Stillwater, included the specific weight of a community that had showed up on Front Street in December to watch her walk back into a life they had already buried. Cole Danner was not sent to prison. Judge Whitmore ruled the fraud civil, the arson attributable primarily to May Duvall's installation decision, the false statement about the sheepskin coat morally indefensible but legally insufficient for criminal perjury because it had been made in a doorway rather than under oath. What Judge Whitmore did in his private chambers on the case's final day was take Cole Danner aside and explain to him in language that existed on no official record that any man who attempted to build a future in this territory under the name Danner would find certain letters already waiting for him in every courthouse he entered, appended to his name before he could introduce himself. Cole left Millhaven on the 16th of April. He did not come to say goodbye to Wren. He did leave that morning a small package wrapped in butcher paper with Otto Fenwick for delivery to her, accompanied by a folded note written in a hand that had learned to use its left side because the right had not yet healed straight. The package contained the pewter thimble. He had bought it back from the pawnbroker on Front Street over 3 long evenings with his one working hand, and he had polished it. She could see the evidence of effort in the surface, the small imperfections of a man doing delicate work with an arm still healing. The note read, "I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I do not ask. I return what I can. The rest is on a ledger I will carry east until I have paid the balance. C.D." She read the note twice. She placed it inside the front cover of Ruth's diary beside the note from the second chamber. Beside the note, Jonas Calloway had told her he was going to write to his sister. She placed the thimble on the shelf above the Blue Elk kitchen counter where it caught the morning light that came through the window at the east end of the room, and she left it there until June, when she moved it to a shelf of her own. She did not rebuild on the Danner land. The Danner land was the shape of a foundation where a house had burned the shape of a life that had ended badly, and she had not come down off the Warden Peaks to reclaim the outline of someone else's failure. She used $1,700 of her settlement in early May to purchase a parcel of 520 acres at the base of the Warden Peaks from a widower named Harmon, who was moving his children to Oregon. The land had a good spring, a stand of cedar, a level meadow of 35 acres, capable of supporting cattle, and a clear line of sight from its northern boundary up to the ridge above the fissure. She hired a builder named Schofield from the county seat and his 2 sons to raise a house on the meadow-squared timber stone foundation, stone chimney lined by a mason from Billings, whose credentials she had verified through 3 separate references before she agreed to a price. A root cellar dug into the hillside deep enough to hold 10 winters of preserved stores. A wood stove chosen personally at the county seat merchant's exposition on the basis of a testing document she had read that February selected for draft efficiency and material quality rather than ornamentation. They finished the house on the 11th of August, 1886, and it had 4 rooms on the ground floor, 2 upstairs, a wide porch facing east across the meadow toward the wagon road, so that any woman traveling that road in the wrong month of the year would see the porch lantern before she could make out the house behind it. Stillwater chose the smaller of the upstairs rooms. Wren took the larger. The two front rooms on the ground floor she set aside as a schoolroom because she had come through the winter to understand that the specific debt she owed to Ruth Calloway was not a debt that could be discharged through a single act of shelter. She opened the school on the 15th of September, 1886. The sign Stillwater had lettered on a piece of cedar plank that Otto Fenwick planed for the purpose read, Warden Peaks School Practical Learning for Women and Children. It taught reading, writing, arithmetic, the identification of local medicinal herbs from her mother's receipt book, the setting of snares, the turning of shirt collars, the tying of knots capable of holding a load, the reading of a barometer, the safe installation of a stovepipe, and on Saturday mornings the firing of a Colt peacemaker at a paper target pinned to a hay bale in the south meadow. It cost nothing to attend. It was open to any woman or child in the county who could reach the porch. Its first term enrolled 11 students, 7 women, 4 children. One of them, a girl of 9 whose father had until October been a foreman on the Danner operation, and who arrived on the first morning carrying a tin cup and a look of absolute determined concentration that reminded Wren with a force that briefly stopped her mid-sentence of another girl who had arrived at difficult places carrying the same expression. The letter from the Northern Territory arrived on the 22nd of September, 1886. It was addressed in a firm hand in ink, the color of weak tea, to Miss Wren Calloway, care of the Blue Elk Inn, Millhaven, Montana. Hedda brought it out to the school on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying it in front of her at a slight distance the way a person carries something whose contents they can feel through the paper. Wren read it on the porch in the last of the September light, Stillwater beside her, Hedda standing in the doorway behind them both. The letter was 3 pages. It was signed at the bottom, Ruth Calloway Prescott, in the same firm hand as the name on the diary's first page, unchanged by 11 years, except for a slight tremor in the loop of the initial R, the kind of tremor that comes not from age but from the particular weight of writing a name aloud after a long silence. Ruth was 54. She had kept a boarding house on the main street of a mining settlement in the Northern Territory since 1876, renting 6 rooms to the widows and daughters of miners who had gone underground and not returned. She had married in 1879 a mining engineer named Amos Prescott, who had proposed across a plate of beans in her kitchen and who had in every subsequent year performed the specific ongoing labor of loving a woman who had built her own shelter with her own hands before she ever agreed to share it with anyone. She had 2 sons. The elder was named for her grandfather. The younger, 6 years old, learning to read by the light of the same lamp Ruth used for correspondence, was named Ezekiel Jonas Prescott. She had received on the 14th of September a letter from her brother containing a smaller sealed envelope from a woman named Wren Calloway, whom Ruth did not know but whose name her brother had described with a precision that told Ruth he was not describing a stranger in the way you describe a stranger. She had read both letters. She had sat for a long time at her kitchen table without moving. She had told her husband that evening the full shape of a story she had told him only in fragments across 7 years of marriage: the whip on the nail, the fissure, the stove, the winter on her own, the morning she had walked north on a September road and not looked back, because looking back was a thing you did not give to the life you were leaving. The second paragraph of the letter read, Miss Calloway, I do not know you. I have not seen the country of the Warden Peaks in 11 years. What I know is that a woman who has read the last page of a book I left and understood it well enough to bring my brother the book instead of the story of it is a woman I owe a particular kind of debt. I did not know when I left the mountain whether anyone would find what I built there. I hoped in the specific quiet of a woman who had learned at considerable cost that a lantern in a window is only a lantern if a stranger walks into its light of her own accord. You have walked into that light. You have kept it burning by your own account. You have added to what I built without permission and without apology, which is the only way anything worth having is ever added to. The letter went on. Ruth asked one favor, the only favor she had ever asked of a stranger, she wrote, and the last she intended to ask. She asked Wren to keep the diary, not to return it, not to archive it, but to keep it on a shelf in the house she had built with her own hands, in a room where the morning light fell on it, with the specific expectation that the next woman who needed it would find it there. In return, Ruth would send in a separate parcel, a small package containing a second key to a box she suspected Wren had not yet found behind a loose stone in the north wall of the second chamber at the height of a woman's shoulder. In the box were 3 maps she had not had time to include with the others. 2 shelters she had built in the country to the northeast, 1 more in the timber above the river valley. She had built them for the same reason she had built the one in the Warden Peaks. She had built them because she had not known at the time how many of them there would need to be. She did not know now. She only knew that the number had never been 1. Wren finished the letter. She folded it with the care she gave to things she intended to keep. She placed it inside the front cover of Ruth's diary, with the other notes that had accumulated there across the year, the note from the second chamber, the note from Cole, the note from a woman in Pennsylvania who had written to a woman she had never met because the chain of kept promises demanded it. She sat on the porch of the new house for a long time, watching the light on the ridge above the fissure, thinking about a box she had not yet found in a wall. She had not yet searched about 3 shelters in country. She had not yet seen about the arithmetic of a number that was not 1 and had never been 1. The following morning, she and Stillwater rode out along the wagon road toward the base of the Warden Peaks on the 2 horses she had bought from Harmon with the land, a chestnut named Meridian, a bay named Sunday. They tied the horses at the cedar root, climbed the switchbacks she had cut into the cliff face during the 2nd week of March, when the melt made the work possible. They came through the fissure at 10 o'clock in the morning of the 23rd of September, 1886, 1 year and 1 week after the morning. Cole Danner had stood on a porch with a woman in kid gloves and used the word arrangement. The chamber was cold. The stove was cold. Everything she had left was precisely where she had left it on the morning of December 1st, folded and stacked with the economy of a person who intended to return. She went to the second chamber first, lit the lamp, measured the north wall at shoulder height, found the loose stone in the 3rd course, reached behind it, brought out a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth that had not yet gone brittle. Inside 3 maps in Ruth's brown ink, each one showing country she had not traveled, each X labeled in Ruth's hand with the single word, shelter. At the bottom of the box, a second key on a leather thong and a small folded scrap of paper on which Ruth had written in her firm, unhurried hand. The key opens a door in a shed at the 3rd X on the 3rd map. The door is at the back. Do not go alone. Wren closed the box. She looked at Stillwater. He looked back at her. Neither of them spoke immediately. In the silence, she could hear the particular hush of the chamber, the hush of a room that had already held this knowledge for 11 years and was not surprised to be passing it forward. She carried the box back to the main chamber. She set Ruth's diary on the natural stone shelf above the cold stove in the space between the tin of matches and the jar of preserves she had replaced from Hedda's kitchen in August, beside the small cedar horse Stillwater had carved the previous December. She set the letter from the Northern Territory beside the diary in its own oilcloth packet. She set the tin box with the 3 maps and the second key beside the letter. She stood in the chamber for a long time. Then she said it aloud in the level voice she had used at every juncture that had mattered across the last year. The number is not 1. It has never been 1. It will not be 1 after me. The stove was cold. The wind in the fissure was quiet. The chamber received the sentence in the silence of a place that had been holding that particular truth since 1875, waiting only for a second voice to speak it into the air where it could be heard. Before they left, she fitted a plank door across the fissure entrance from the outside. 3 pieces, hauled up in separate trips the previous week, hung on iron hinges she had forged herself in Otto Fenwick's back room over 2 evenings. The door had a lock. She did not set the lock. She hung the key on a wooden peg on the outside face of the door at the height of a woman's shoulder beside a small brass plate into which she had punched the night before with a nail set and a hammer. The single line she wanted any traveler to read who came to that fissure in the wrong month of the year: "This door is not locked. Take what you need. Leave a note if you have time." They rode down in the last of the September sun. The wagon road back toward Millhaven lay the color of dried grass, pale gold against the darker ground. Behind them, the Warden Peaks threw their long shadow across the meadow, and in that shadow the porch of the new house held a single burning lantern that Hedda had lit at 4 o'clock as she did every afternoon that fall, whether or not she was expecting anyone in particular to come home along that road. Sometimes when the autumn winds began to sharpen and the season's first heavy flakes came off the western ranges, Wren would ride Meridian out from the porch to the cedar root climb. The switchbacks alone stand at the plank door with her hand on the brass plate. She would not open it on those visits. She would only touch the lettering. She would listen for a moment to the mountain's particular quiet, the specific hush of stone that had kept its word across 11 years and more, that had been keeping it still. Then she would ride back down to the porch, where Stillwater would be waiting on the step, with a book open in his lap, where Hedda's lantern would already be burning against the coming dark, where the pewter thimble sat on the windowsill, catching whatever light the day had left in it. The mountain had not saved her. She had saved herself. The mountain had only been the room in which she had finally met the woman she had always been, without the interference of anyone else's opinion of what that woman was allowed to be. What she built afterward on the meadow at its base was the sentence she had chosen to write with the remaining portion of her life, in the deliberate expectation that some other woman on some other cold morning would read it and understand. The door is not locked. Take what you need. Leave a note if you have time. The lantern in the window is only a lantern if someone walks into its light of her own accord, and every woman who did was proof that the number had never been one and would not be one after her.